Hello and welcome to
Hello.
first few
Hello.
seconds already derailing.
Whoa.
Hello everyone. So we have got quite the show for today. Those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. If you are new, let us know hello in the chat. We'll keep that as a little space to kind of connect with everyone. But yeah, welcome to Debates with Hess and Yates. Today's topic is one that I'm sure a few of you have been following in the animal community so far, which is whether it's acceptable or not for animal advocates to use the Holocaust analogy. So one thing
Jeremy,
that would...
are you saying that other people have talked about this already?
Oh, yeah, I mean,
Oh,
should we
okay.
just... Do you think it's already been covered? Should we just leave it?
No, I
It's
didn't know.
everything's been addressed. Just leave the show right there.
No, I didn't know anybody had mentioned it before. That's all. I thought we would
Oh
first.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's been a big thing. I'm surprised you haven't seen anything about it.
yeah. Yeah, there has been a few waves, hasn't there?
But yeah, if you could, it would really help us out to help defeat the anti-vegan algorithms to like the video. But then also, if you know anyone who, because I think a lot of us has I think one good thing that's come out of this is we're all talking about these things more and hopefully in a productive way. But if you know others who are interested in the topic, just drop them a link with the video. Like personal messages probably work best because then, more likely to see it. Because yeah, the more people we can share these ideas with, the better. So just saying hello to everyone. Hello to Animal Liberation Ninja, such a great name. In there nice and early. I won't say hi to ourselves. VegMet Codbod, Terry, Vegan Cannibal, Elliot, Deb, Jennifer, Wendy, Michelle, Tom, Nikki, Michael, Kristen, Amber, Vegan Pixie Warrior, Michael. Yeah, I mean, welcome everyone. Some new names and some familiar names, and great to see everyone.
I need to know the reasoning behind VegMet Codbot. That's Codbod, isn't it? Codbod. Yeah, that's it.
The request has been put out there. We'll see. Hello, Mary and Ronnie. So I feel like there's a few kind of qualifying things we should do before we get too far into it. I mean, I think to me, I would just attach, I think we already added in the title, just a general content warning for this discussion, because I know for me, this has been quite a challenging live stream to prepare for, because as part of it, I kind of did a bit of a deep dive on the history of human on human atrocities and really just seeing the darkest side of humanity. So with that in mind, I am going to be doing a summary video. I have no idea how I'm going to compress this into about 10 minutes, but I'm going to try. So you may like to engage with the subject in that way. If this talk today gets to be a bit much, we're not going to... I don't think we're showing anything graphic, as my understanding. So, but there is obviously going to be graphic ideas discussed. And yeah, I think we'll do our best to address these comments, the topic fairly and fully. But I mean, we're only really getting the conversation going. It's really not so much about Roger and myself. It's really just a matter of all of us talking about these ideas. So we'll do our best to keep our eye on the chat. But unlike our Hangout sessions, the debates will probably be... It's going to be less prioritized until the end. So just talking about a bit of a running order, because we're trying to respond to the feedback that our last debate was a bit messy, which is very, very fair comparison. We're going to open with the framing, and then we're going to try to do a couple of opening statements with around 5 minutes each. And then the rows 7, 8, and 9 are really the three key parts. Is really the accuracy, specifically around the definitions and specific details. Also around the effectiveness and the potential risks. And then similar to the opening statements, a couple of 5-minute closing statements. And then it's everyone else's chance to weigh in. So if we miss something in the comments, you can drop it in the comments then. And we'll also invite anyone who wants to come on screen with us. Have I missed anything, Roger?
Yeah, everything. You missed everything.
That at least just gets us started. Hello, Nella and Chris. Great to see everyone. So, I mean, I think...
I'm getting a feeling from you, Jeremy, that you think this is a bit of a dodgy subject and a bit complicated. Because that's it. It is, isn't it? This issue has kind of been raised in the movement over and over again. Really, it's not new. It's just that there's a new wave of it at the moment. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and I'll So I can start with my 5 minute blurb here in a moment, but because that's something I want to chat about as well, which I guess I can just do now is my observation, and this is not I think one of the keys today is we're not going to talk about individuals. We're going to talk about the ideas, which I appreciate they're entangled, but I think that talking about the actual issues and ideas is going to be more productive. With saying that, I have observed a lot of people when they're approaching this subject seem to be at one end of the spectrum or the other. Either we're going to use it no matter what, or if you use it, you're racist, you're anti-Semitic, and there's a whole range of things in between those two. And I mean, really, today is just trying to address that more fully, for me. No, speechless already. I've spoken you into submission. So I just remembered we've got to do. How I almost forgot the opening poll. What am I doing? All right, so I need to get that in the chat. So what I will drop in the chat here, and really the whole idea behind this is it's anonymous, and it's really we'll just take a poll at the beginning and end of the conversation, which we appreciate isn't perfect because people will be joining us and leaving, but it'll at least give us an idea of what is happening. So if you can just, if you're on a phone, just flick back to the video after you vote. It should just take 2 seconds. It's a straightforward question. Basically just saying, let me see if I can pull it up here.
You never mentioned you're going to do a poll, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm just going to change my, as those are coming in, looks like we're getting responses as we speak. So I'll just get the technology to try to cooperate. So that will be, so this is the question. We've got about 7 responses. I see 44 people in the chat, so we will give it a little bit more time. The framing is obviously quite critical around this, and we'll try not to influence it too much because we do want to have as objective results as possible.
Yeah, also, Jeremy, we, I mean, obviously, in terms of this discussion, it usually ends up, and this is a trigger warning again, folks, is that it usually ends up talking about issues about slavery and sexual violence. So would those be incorporated in this question? That, is it acceptable to use those words as well, do you think? Or do you want to just keep it to the H word?
I think we'll talk about those as analogies to the analogy, but for me, I think it's best if we focus on the Holocaust specifically analogy.
Yeah, fair enough.
Just in the order of completeness. So we are nearing about half of the people here. So let me just get this, see if we can get this up on the screen here. All right, so we'll let the responses keep coming in. We're about half of the results in, so obviously don't want to influence the vote too much. But it does look like about 52% of you say that yes, it is acceptable. 20, obviously the numbers are changing a little bit. 23% is that no, it is not acceptable, and then also another 23% is open to the discussion, which I think really, hopefully we're all open to the discussion a little bit. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. So. Yeah, do those results shock you at all, Roger, or pretty much what you expected?
Yeah, pretty much, I would think. I actually thought it might be a bit more balanced than that, to be honest. But I mean, it's interesting. I don't know whether that's a reflection of the kind of debate that's gone on in the movement so far, which would be interesting if it is, because I don't think the debates have been particularly enlightening. There've been quite a lot of videos that have been put out. And they've been interesting from a number of reasons, which we'll get onto, I'm sure. But yeah, I thought it'd be a bit more balanced than that.
Well, just to put your mind at ease, Roger, the way will be, and this, I think a lot of the times the language and the framing of this thing, it'll be this kind of win-lose type framing. But if we're all exploring the ideas, we're all, quote, winning as far as I'm concerned. But just to clarify things, we will be using a shift system. So at some point, I'll enter the numbers in, and it's just basically the absolute percentage change. So even though Roger's starting, Team Roger is starting with around 19%, as long as he shifts more than my side does, that's really what we're after. So just to get an idea of how productive the conversation was at presenting the two viewpoints, and if actually anybody kind of changed their views.
Well, I
So
got
with
all
that,
my
I'll
people.
close
I got
this
all
one
my
off.
people to vote yes, and then they're going to change.
That would be a pretty good strategy, I have to say. So, hello, Wendy. I don't think we said hello to you yet. And as I say, we'll do our best to keep an eye on the chat, but it's bound to get a bit, we're probably going to focus more on the conversation. So, should we start opening statements? What are we at? We're right on schedule. I have to say, I'm going to try to add keep things pegged here. But look, right, 5:10, right on schedule. This will probably be the only time this entire session that we actually stick to time. So I think this moment should be celebrated. I will just get my.
People have been commenting about my water here. It's not. What are people thinking? Vodka, I suppose. Do you know? I can't remember. I'm not sure if I've ever had vodka. Funny enough. I'm sure I must have
Okay.
done. Yeah. There you go.
I wouldn't say you're missing too terribly much,
No.
but
Proper lightweight.
to
Thanks,
each their
Wendy.
own, I
Thanks,
guess.
Wendy. You're a pal. You are, Wendy.
All right, we'll just. So if we can just get this. StreamYard has some peculiar things to do to get the audio to work correctly, so hopefully I've switched successfully. And
Jeremy is tech stressed today, folks. Just to let you know.
there's a lot going on. There's topics. There's tech. We'll do our best. All right. So
if I was doing it, Jeremy, it would just be smooth.
You'll get your chance tomorrow. So 5 minutes on the clock. I will do my statement. You can do yours, and then we'll go from there and get into the nitty gritty detail, I guess, as best we can and as respectfully as we can. So I'd like to start off with a brief clip, as you can see here. So it is subtitled, so you can follow those captions. But Rose, otherwise known as Cheap Lazy Vegan, who's, just as an aside, has about 750,000 subscribers. So I think obviously has a lot of influence and uses the focus on the dietary aspects of veganism through food to actually talk about some real critical topics, as Rose is doing here. So it's just about 45 seconds, and then I'll have some opening remarks, and then we'll turn it over to Roger, with any luck.
Shoot.
Let me know if you can't hear the sound, Roger.
Okay.
I think the other side sees it as lifting animals up, whereas this side sees it as bringing certain humans down. This side sees that, it's time that we give animals the respect that they deserve and, talk about their suffering and give the suffering as much weight as we give human suffering and, talk about it for what it is, how gruesome it is and how bad it is. So I do believe that it is a very speciesist viewpoint, and I'm not here to point fingers or call anybody bad or anything like that. Definitely not. I think it's very hard to get away from that speciesist viewpoint because this is how we live in our society. Like, we're in this bubble of speciesism. It's hard to, remove ourselves from it. But I do think it is a speciesist view that we are offended by comparisons of human suffering to animal suffering.
Hey, Jeremy, it's not like you.
And you. Sorry.
It's not like you to focus on a video which is on about suffering all the time.
Well, there's a lot we can unpack from that, but see, Roger's already trying to take away from my 5 minutes already derailing.
Yeah, come on.
In the classic of animal advocacy disruptions.
The clock's ticking.
So,
come on.
Someone's got to keep. This is what happens when we moderate ourselves. It's pure anarchy, right? Yeah. So obviously, I think we're trying to inject some humor where we can, but this is obviously a very serious topic. I think, if anything, the last week or two has shown us is that this is an incredibly complex topic. And as I alluded to before, I think there's a spectrum of perspectives, and I think that's evidence of in itself that's worthy of discussions or, a so-called debate, and really just an exchange of ideas to see what comes out on top. And from an idea perspective, because I think as animal advocates, we should all be willing to evolve and consider new ideas. And it's not so much about right and wrong. I know we talked about that a moment ago, and it's really just a matter of really taking a good hard look at these ideas and seeing what resonates with us. And I think we can do, if we are willing to do that as individuals in an open-minded way, I think we'll arrive at better conclusions as a wider movement. I think the key thing for me in the framing of this discussion is the word appropriate, which is defined as suitable or proper in the given circumstances, which to me, I think we have to ask ourselves a few questions. Is it appropriate to discuss animal use? Hopefully, everyone on this call agrees that it is. However, is it appropriate when we're at a funeral to start outreaching someone who's just lost their loved one? Probably not. And I think there are certain circumstances where the analogy we're discussing is appropriate. And that's what I'm going to make a case for today. Now, I think the key thing around this is nuances. And I know for myself, when I first became an animal advocate, and even till now, I personally don't actually use the analogy. We can get into the details of why that is later on. It has to do more with the content I focus on and what I think makes sense for that. Happy animals at sanctuary, basically. But I think, to me, the key here is talking about specific scenarios where the analogy is used, because, let's be honest, regardless of anything any of us discusses, there's going to be people that continue to use the analogy. So I think it's an important part of the discussion is talking about how to use the analogy. And I think specifically we can talk about social media or on the street or live conversations, some of the things we can do to help mitigate that risk. And the thing I would build on from what Rose was saying is not so much about the offense, but the potential harm that's caused. So I think we all want to use language with some teeth in it. I think that's a lot of the resistance to not using the analogy, which, I see both sides of it, to be honest. And, it is a matter of being fluid with our language. And I know I quite enjoy coming up with alternatives. So I think that's a big question today. Is there other alternative language that's just as strong, or is this actually the strongest language that we can use? And we'll talk about some of the wider comparisons, I think, that Roger alluded to, and just looking at some of that, because I'm curious to see where this conversation comes out. I know I've learned a lot this week about the darkness of humanity, which, again, I think is going to be a theme throughout this. So bear that in mind, and hopefully at the end of this conversation we can move more towards unity. And I know that is an incredibly overused word, but I don't just mean unity for the sake of unity and brushing complex topics to the side, but genuine, having the hard conversations, a real authentic unity, or at least striving for that, and striving for understanding each other on these things. And I think when I think about this topic and really all, tough conversations, it reminds me of a quote from the Persian poet Rumi, which is, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there." So hopefully we can find that field here today, and especially for Roger and myself, hopefully we can find some sort of a field. So that's that. And
thanks for that, Jeremy. And I think, as you alluded to, I think we're both gonna not have an absolute position here both ways. If you could perhaps put Joe's comment up, because we're gonna talk about that. I just want to say, by the way, hi Joe. Not seen you for a good while, but we're gonna talk about that. But we're not going to do it right now. But we're going to come into that, because we're going to talk about the definitions and the fact that this issue is really complicated by all the different meanings about the Holocaust, but also this dispute about the ownership, which is a really tricky issue that Jeremy and I have talked about off air, as it were, and the ownership issue. Who gets to claim the ownership for themselves? That kind of issue is quite tricky. So we will come back to that.
Just so you know, that all came out of your time for your opening statement.
No, it didn't.
Right. When you're ready, sir.
Yes. What was it? The opening statement by Roger Yates. Okay, that's the one. So I was going to start by saying that when Tom Reagan, first of all, I actually want to kind of just repeat the content warning for all the session that Jeremy's already given. So I think we ought to kind of repeat that now and again for people coming on. I was going to start by saying that Tom Reagan, when he started the summary of the famous 1989 debate about animal rights at the Royal Institute in London, he said that he had an almost impossible task. And I think, to be quite honest, that Jeremy and I are kind of really in that kind of same boat, if you like. All my comments can be subsumed under this general idea. The underline for me is that vegan activism is about education. We are educated. We are educators. We are we plant seeds. So we're seed planters. I've said many times that social movements are claims makers in civil society. Social movements identify what they see as a problem or problems in society, or they claim there isn't a problem, but then they make claims about them. So, that's the movement and the counter movement kind of dialectic there. In recent years, what we've got with the vegan movement is the idea that we've focused on bringing about cultural change by talking to people, by and large. That's our methodology, if you like. So, please draw me a farm. And the reason I say that is that I recently updated a video of a sociology talk I did originally in 2016 at VegFest Brighton. And I'm updating it there's an online VegFest event later this month. In the video, I mentioned that I used to give talks to non-vegans. I would give them a pencil and paper, and I would ask them to please draw me a farm. Now, as vegans, we can probably all guess the kind of farms that people drew. Free range, yes. Happy other animals, yes. Family units. There was homes and not cages. And of course, there was not a slaughterhouse truck in sight. So people were drawing for me the farms that they knew, or the farms that they thought they knew, or the farms that they wanted to know. And as cultural resources, they were thinking back to scenes in those books that they'd read as children. They might have done it with carers or parents, or they might have seen films like Babe. What's going on there is called indexicality, or the indexicality of meaning. So the word farm, if you like, triggered an index of meaning. As claims makers, it's clear that our language needs to be clear, but it's crucial if we're using language to communicate our message. Recipient design is a phrase used to talk about how we orient our talk with our audience in mind. Now, we do this automatically as social animals, but it's actually quite complex if you analyze it. On the one hand, we in the social movement, we want to talk to people in ways that they will understand our talk. On the other hand, vegans are in the business of ripening people up, in Donald Watson's term, because we want to change our culture. What communicators do typically, even when they want to challenge people, is try not to lose them. We try not to block them in terms of them understanding what we want to say to them ultimately. And we try not to alienate them to the extent that communication breaks down. So words like Holocaust, rape, slavery are words in this discussion which are extremely problematic in this respect. When people hear Holocaust, they hear the Jewish Holocaust with a capital H, the one that occurred during the Second World War. When people hear rape, research suggests that they picture as the rapist a male stranger by and large. Stranger danger was the slogan. They don't tend to picture a husband or a brother or a father. When people hear the word slavery, they tend to hear or think about the transatlantic slave trade. So if our aim is to communicate with people, even if to challenge them, and they've got these and other similar ideas in their head, then we've got to be careful about how we frame our communication. We are skilled communicators, generally speaking, because we're social animals. We kind of do it all the time. The internet kind of gets in the way, but we have to take care. And the final point I wanted to say was that in some of the discourse over this, I seem to see from the activist community in particular, this idea that their kind of favorite words and their most effective words are being taken away from them. And I think we can be critical about that. We're not short of words. And I don't think those 3 words in particular have any particular weight and power. But we'll come on to that in the general discussion. So, Jeremy, can you run the film, please, as they say in Hollywood?
If you're talking to someone in Manchester city centre about how many animals are getting murdered every year, and they're not quite getting it, and then you say, well, look, we could call it a Holocaust. Those people's minds will jump instantly to the Jewish Holocaust.
Okay.
All right. Well, I'm sure it's all resolved after that, right? No real need to keep chatting. Controversy answered.
Yeah, you're right, Michelle. Grumpy gets everywhere.
Yeah, hello for anybody. I think Veganita has joined us since we started. Hello, Cranky Vegan. How are you doing, Jake? And then, yeah, where are we? I'm trying to keep things on track here. We'll see how we manage, but we're doing pretty good. Few minutes behind, but we're getting there. Should we? I don't know if it's helpful to put this up.
Get on with it. What's the matter with you? Get on with it.
Well, I don't know if it's helpful to share this in between, just so everyone can get an idea here. So we're gonna move on to the accuracy here. So we've got this pegged for about 10 minutes, which as I was making my pre-live stream coffee, it occurred to me 10 minutes is incredibly ambitious because we could probably do a whole live stream just on the accuracy side of things, but we'll try to kind of do it justice without kind of getting too far down that hole. So what do you think? Should we just launch into it? Is it accurate? I don't know if we want to just start throwing stuff out there. Maybe let us know in the comments if you think the analogy is accurate, and we can go from there. We could start maybe first talking about the definitions. I mean, I guess the easiest thing is looking at the word Holocaust and how, depending on the definition, basically it means slaughter on a mass scale, and originally started with killing or so-called sacrifice of our fellow animals. So it's actually been derived for them, used for a human injustice, and now the suggestion is that we can't use it for other animals. What do you do you think that's a bit interesting, Roger? Or?
Well, also that original definition also talked about killing by burning was the original one. So the answer to this thing about is it accurate comes down to kind of depends on what you're talking about. And so, you know, this goes to the thing that Joe raised. You know, are we talking about Holocaust small h? Are we talking about Holocaust large h? Are we talking about the Holocaust? Because all of this is very complicated, and it's also very contested. This is a contested arena on all these different levels. And this is coming back to the issues about the ownership of the word, this kind of thing. Because from an ethno-methodological point of view, which is kind of like the skills that people bring to their social interactions, when they hear on any level the word Holocaust, they will think about the Jewish Holocaust, which is also known and written about as the Holocaust. And yet there's been lots of Holocausts. It's just that there's a contest about what does that word mean. Are we talking about original definitions, dictionary definitions? Are we talking about just the Jewish Holocaust? What about all the other ones, which some occurred before, some occurred after? They tend to. It's a very political issue, this. So it's difficult, you know. Even just trying to work out if you can accurately use this word in those senses. And then we've got a kind of fundamental problem, which of course I brought up a few times. And it's a fundamental problem if we're talking about the Holocaust, which is that the Holocaust was about eradicating a whole category of beings. And that, obviously that's not what we do. In whatever we want to call our exploitation, our rights violations that go on against other animals, one thing that we certainly don't do is try to eradicate them. We're not trying to eradicate them. In fact, we actually breed them, which wasn't done in the Holocaust.
Maybe I can jump in there because I think that's a key. To me, that is probably one of the key differences. The question is it enough of a difference that makes, because I think a key thing to think about here is analogies aren't meant to suggest two injustices are the same. They're suggesting that they're similar, and I think it's the similarities to me that are really why people use analogies. I mean, as far as the breeding thing, I mean, I might as well just chuck it out there. I don't think we'll spend a whole lot of time on it. There is that whole aspect of, I feel like we're going to need to say trigger warnings every 10 minutes with this thing, but there's the whole concept of genocidal rape. So there is this weird aspect to genocides where there is actually breeding in a way. I don't know how much we want to dive into that issue specifically, because I think on both parts, it kind of takes us away from what are the similarities. Because to me, it's the similarities that are useful, because analogies are very useful at telling a story. I mean, if anybody's seen Seb Alex's video, excellent look at the Armenian, atrocity. A lot of different words I think we could attach to that one, but he mentioned specifically in that video that effectively primitive gas chambers were used. Basically closing people in caves and then using smoke from a fire. So I think I hear you on the breeding thing, but here's a question for you. I mean, not, steel manning, steel personing, anything. You yourself, do you think that makes the analogy inappropriate to use, or do you think we're going to get into the core reason for that later?
I think it just makes it really problematic, because it's not the same. And also
much worse in that sense, because instead of you wipe everybody out, looking at humans and other animals the same, it's worse in a sense. And I'm not trying to invalidate anyone's experience for just, part of
the problem though, Jeremy, is the fact that it's as though, it's almost like, it's interesting, is it our fault here? We lack as animal advocates the words to use. We can talk, we're going to talk about moral shocks and everything. We tend to show people stuff rather than explain our way into it. I think a little bit there's that going on, but it's I don't know. I think this one's a complicated one, in the sense that the Nazis wanted to eliminate categories of beings. We don't do that. We're actually creating units of production as we see it. I mean, this bleeds into the rape thing about, the kind of what's going on in terms of the perpetrator. What is their intention of doing it?
That point right there, if I can just jump in, is what's important, the intent of the perpetrator or the victim from the victim's perspective?
Oh, well, I think we always should focus on the victim. But the intention of the perpetrator is part and parcel of it. You mentioned genocidal rape, right now, and you said that amounted to what you call breeding. Now I know that you've kind of looked into this. It's been painful for you in the last few days. But were they wanting to breed in order to sell the offspring for profit?
So, and I apologize in advance if I laugh at any of this stuff. It's literally nervous laughter because I'm just trying to process the depravity of some of this stuff. But the quote I'd like to read along those lines is from a research article I was reading specifically on this topic around genocidal rape, that the research concludes that the systematic use of forced impregnation, mutilation, sexual humiliation, and targeting of female identity carries a genocidal intent, resulting in the fragmentation of cultures and communities, and furthers female subordination. And a part of the other bits that I've read are around basically you're basically diluting the ethnicity. So yes, there is an intent to
that is totally different, isn't it, from what farmers set out to do when they're artificially inseminating a cow. Her offspring is a production unit for them.
If you'll grant me the space to think out loud, I think isn't part of, and I want to put up the spreadsheet because we're already nearly the end of this 10-minute section, and there's a lot to ground to cover, I think. But I mean, isn't it part of it? Isn't just wiping out one species, it's increasing the numbers of another. So yes, it's completely different, but I think it's more similar than it's different when we look at all the aspects of these different atrocities. I mean, if I can just pull up the spreadsheet, because it might be a good point of communication. Just a caveat here, this is aggregated to the best of my knowledge, but this is purely for discussion purposes only. If anybody wants to follow up on any of the detail here, please let me know. It's really just meant to create a perspective here, because the key question I would have here is, would we describe these other events as a Holocaust? Because through the stuff I've researched, one of the key distinctions between genocide, which came up coincidentally around the time the Jewish Holocaust was happening, was, for the Armenian genocide. So if that was, and that was before the so-called Holocaust happened, and that came to it. So my thoughts are a bit jumbled. There's a lot to process here, but the key thing here is that, to me, what I understand, Holocaust in the human sense really came to prominence as the criminalization of a genocide, specifically through the Nuremberg trials. So, I mean, we could say a Holocaust has to be tried, and genocides that aren't tried aren't Holocaust. But again, similar to the different intent, I think it's still
like a legal overlay on the definition. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think back to your point around ethno. So in your opening statement, you mentioned the associations that people hear when they say the word. So I think, what associations? Maybe we could dig into that a little bit. What associations do people hear with the word? And the question I have, and this is kind of a bit of a segue to the next section around effectiveness, is what are those associations, and can they actually bring about a discussion about the speciesism both in our language as well as in general? What are those associations necessarily a complete negative?
Yeah. Well, also we got the kind of bit of a kind of elephant in the room, in the sense that we're supposed to be talking about using all this as an analogy in order to talk about other animals. I mean, this almost like points to what I was getting at by clipping that bit out from Grumpy Vegan Grandad. The fact that there was a conversation, he wanted to talk about animal use, wanted to talk about animal rights violations, wasn't really getting anywhere, and so he kind of punched in the word Holocaust, thinking that's going to help, and as he said, focused everybody's mind on the Jewish Holocaust. The Jewish Holocaust is a controversial political phrase in itself. I mean, we could I'm not totally sure on this, but I don't know whether, if people use the phrase Jewish Holocaust, they would be accused of anti-Semitism, because I know from the Jewish community's point of view, they prefer the Holocaust phrase. And if you look in every definition of Holocaust, you've got that. You've got small h, talks about burning and mass killing. Then you've got large H. He doesn't say the Jewish Holocaust. He usually says the Holocaust. Then it says referring to the Jewish Holocaust, right?
To that point, though, isn't there a move to in the Jewish community to move away from Holocaust and start referring to it as Shoah? Because if we look at the etymology of Holocaust, burnt sacrifice,
I think that's just their name for it.
I've read some stuff that actually the etymology of Holocaust as a sacrifice is quite disrespectful to the victims. I don't know what the survey results would say as how predominant that viewpoint is, but
well,
I guess back to the question.
I don't know.
Do you think these other events could be described as a Holocaust?
Depends on the definition. If you're talking about mass killing, then clearly yes.
Okay.
If you're talking about, I mean, again, if you want to impose what apparently is the original definition, which is like a ritual sacrifice including fire, then perhaps not.
Doesn't suit any of them, does it? Well,
no.
Depending on.
I mean that doesn't even fit the Jewish Holocaust, in the sense that I think it's true that the reason they moved to the gas chambers, again, trigger warnings here, folks, is because the soldiers were getting so tired by shooting people so much. It was actually exhausting for the soldiers. And interesting, there's a book by Zygmunt Bauman called Modernity in the Holocaust. I think it's 89, and he said that the company that produced the gas was it was a pest control company, and that's the way that the Nazis ended up creating that kind of hatred of the Jews in the German population, because they had a problem doing that. It took a long time. They had to propagandize it, Goebbels and all this kind of stuff, and it took many years. And one of the things they had to do was create the ghettos, because we know sociologically that if you create social distance, you can then create moral distance. When there was no social distance, then it didn't really matter what the Nazis said about the Jews, because the Jew next door didn't correspond with the nasty stereotype that they were trying to create. So they removed the population, and then they could say things about them which had more resonance, especially when some of the kind of self-fulfilling prophecies came too, because the Nazis came up with the slogan, which was Jews equals lice equals typhus. And the reason why that resonated was the fact that because of the way that the ghettos were organized, then a lot of Jewish people got typhus in the ghettos. That was because of the conditions, right? And so it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the Holocaust, according to Bauman, was characterized within the German population as a kind of like vermin control, kind of, the idea of social hygiene, that, you need to clean this place up.
So it sounds like we're on a similar page, that this word is acceptable for other human atrocities. So I think that's an important thing to line up on. But I think what you're gesturing at here, and I appreciate the charitable nature, because I do think it shifts more towards the position being, or the analogy being accurate. One thing that I think is true of most, if not all, human atrocities is the so-called animalization and of the target group, and that was gestured at in the opening clip from Rose that I played before my opening statement, which to me is really key here, because I think the key difference in this perspective is the people who use the analogy. It's not that they want to bring humans down to other animals; they actually want to lift other animals up. Whereas from the other perspective, it's being viewed as dehumanizing and bringing them down to the level of other animals. So if we're talking to people and they don't view other animals as equals in a basic moral level, basic moral right perspective, that's where the challenge is. But I think with the right framing, and we'll get into this with the effectiveness, my position would be that if we can do it tactfully, it's accurate enough of an analogy, has an ethno methodology that supports people associating it with the things that will inspire them to take the matter seriously. But we're coming to the end of the section, so feel free to add any other little bits, and then maybe we'll move on to effectiveness. Well,
just on that point that Rose was talking about, the elevation or the devaluing that they're putting into the lesser than. I mean, these are almost like tactics of war, So we tend to call it. I know this has been criticized recently, actually, but they tend to call it depersonalization processes and dehumanization processes, and that's been critiqued, I think, recently. But the way that I tried to talk about that in my PhD was the idea that you're able to conceptually throw a human being over to the other side of the species barrier. And the other side of the species barrier is a very dangerous place to be. Okay, I mean, that is once you're on the other side of the species barrier, whether you're actually human or not, it's an incredibly dangerous place to be, because that's a place where there's no rights, the rights violations galore and all that, right? And this, it's an incredibly bad place. And so if you've got the ability to cast human beings over that barrier, then you're really onto a winner from your point of view, because you've put them into a lesser than status, which means that because the others already over that barrier are killable, that means that the humans that you've cast over it are now killable. Okay, so it's a kind of tactic.
But I guess back to the question, would your position be that the analogy is accurate star? or inaccurate? Maybe just to put a bow on this section.
Well, what interests me the most is the fact that we haven't talked about the analogy. I mean, because it brings up the human situation. Because what exactly are you talking about? You know, you can imagine having this conversation on the street. You'd have spent 20 minutes talking to somebody about the difference. You know, what counts as a Holocaust. Now we're talking about Jewish Holocaust, and what about all that, and what, you know, the ins and outs, and just like we've done today. I mean, we haven't talked about what's going on with other animals. It's been derailed.
I push back on that.
Well, push away.
When we're talking, I mean, talking about the similarities, I think I think we're kind of jumping ahead maybe to the effectiveness part of the side of the discussion, which to me is possibly one of the key things from a tactfulness perspective. I think if we can, but I agree, a key part of the discussion is getting them to see other animals as equals. So that needs to be looped in, talking about speciesism and human superiority and the rest of it. I just focusing in on if the term is accurate, which we've already overrun the time on, so we might as well move on. But to me, the term, while it's not an exact same injustice, but let's be honest, rarely are injustices the same. The question are they similar in the ways that matter, which to me, they are.
Yeah, there's a bit about it that makes me very uncomfortable. We're almost like suggesting to people that if we can't find a human example which is similar, then it doesn't count on its own. That we can't describe the incredibly horrible, disgraceful things that we do to other animals on its own, in its own merit, in its own kind of glorious disgustingness. That's not enough. We've got to say, oh, by the way, it's similar to a Holocaust, or it's similar to this, you know, artificial insemination. Oh, that's a terrible thing. Guess what?
But don't we do that all the time? Don't we use humans as a conduit to get people to respect other animals all the time?
Well, I think that might be a problem. I think that part of it is the fact that we need to be able to describe what goes on with other animals in their own right, as it were, and explain to them why that is a rights violation, and that, you know, that the reason we shouldn't do it is because they're rights bearers. I think it's something to do. I suspect, this is just a speculation, I suspect that it's to do with the moral shocks. I think that we're good at showing people horrible pictures and horrible videos, but we're not particularly good at kind of doing a Tom Reagan and sitting there with people and explaining to them why other animals have rights and why we shouldn't violate their rights. We more like kind of frighten people. In fact, it was said today on a video that a lot of vegans don't necessarily have any kind of general kind of political view of the world, because they've come into the vegan movement because they've been shocked to their core by being shown something. So again, it's a recruitment thing. It's called moral shock. I mean, there's a name for it. We morally shock people.
Well, I think there's different ways we can do that. I like to focus in. To me, it's quite shocking how amazing other animals are in their own unique individuality. That's how I morally shock people. But I think we're getting into the effectiveness section. So should we move on from accuracy? I think otherwise, I think we're a bit ambitious with the 10-minute plan for that one. But just for those of you who have joined us, this is kind of the running order for today. So starting out here on effectiveness next, we're going to plan this for 20 minutes. So as we go, just keep this section in mind, because we're not bringing in as many comments as we normally do, but we'll do that towards the end. So
there's a lot of competing claims about this.
As far as the effectiveness?
Yeah.
All right. Would you like to start with one of the claims, and I'll see if I can compete with it?
Well, there are a lot of people who claim that they weren't really taking much notice of a set of claims making by animal rights folks, but as soon as they heard the Holocaust analogy, it kind of made them think, and that was the thing that either created the vegan in them, or maybe it might be that issue of the jigsaw thing, that maybe that was the thing that put the last bit. I actually suspect. I think some of this is a bit disingenuous. I think some people are saying this because they want it to be true rather than it being true. In the same way as there's a lot of claims in the movement about this particular talk or this particular person made me go vegan. When you actually start to talk to people like that, it tends not to be quite accurate. It tends to be a whole series of things.
Well, no one event. Yeah, but that doesn't discount that one event was part of the process.
No,
But back to your earlier point, because now we're officially.
That's what I'm saying. It wasn't.
But that doesn't answer the question of if it's effective or not. The question isn't was this the sole thing that did it. The question is that was this effective? And if it's part of the jigsaw puzzle, it is effective.
I'm saying that these people are saying that is the reason that they're now vegan. There's been several activists who, over the last week or so who claim that they're almost like suggesting if they hadn't have heard the Holocaust analogy, they wouldn't now be vegan. Now, I mean, that's an interesting kind of.
I haven't seen that claim. Maybe you can link it to me.
I've
link it to me afterwards. I'll take your word for it for the purpose of the discussion. But I think that's a challenge as animal advocates. We don't really have any data. I think that's something that's been a topic for a lot of us is, show us we're, making progress and all that. And I've kind of moved away from that, but, obviously don't want to go too down that because I think it is a bit of a distraction, but it is mostly anecdotal. And I think to me, to be effective, we all have to find words that describe our view of other animals in a way that we think is going to resonate with other people. And that's an incredibly complex thing. I mean, language has become a passion of mine because I think it's an incredibly, it's not so much a science as it is an art as well. And there's a lot we can do with that. But this is a really crude way to phrase this question, to be fair. I mean, we try to put this thing into buckets, but I'm struggling to. I mean, back to your earlier point. It sounded like you were concerned that discussion of the analogy was too human centric, which just back to you on that one. Isn't the framing the animal Holocaust kind of getting around that because the focus is being brought back to other animals?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one, that one. And in fact, we talked, didn't we, during the week that I think there's about 34 references to that in Steve Best's Total Liberation book. Not the video that I keep plugging, but this is the actual book, right? And he talks about the animal Holocaust all the time, and he's very careful to do that with a small h. And that is an interesting one because that's another kind of interesting part of this debate. There's a lot of suggestion. I've seen a lot of suggestion about the effectiveness. That talking about the animal Holocaust is very effective because you can talk about the size of what the problem is, and then there's this intriguing suggestion that they talk about the animal Holocaust with no reference at all to the human ones. Now
it's kind of a given, isn't it?
Well, this is the claim they're making. They're claiming that you can talk about the animal Holocaust with no reference to human Holocaust, and that almost like takes the analogy part of it out because
that's a huge part. That's a huge part of non-speciesist language, isn't it? Referring to hair instead of fur, it gets them to think of them on similar terms to humans. I'm not sure if you're suggesting that's a bad component of it. To me, that's a strength. I'm
not quite sure what you mean by bad component.
So isn't the fact that they already think about the human atrocities when we're using it in an animal-centric context a bonus?
Well, all I'm saying is that I've seen claims of the last week or so that you can talk about the animal Holocaust and that's legitimate because it's as though the animals need their own Holocaust or something. But there's a separate claim which is it's legit to talk about the animal Holocaust, but you can also talk about that without analogizing to human ones. You just talk about the animal Holocaust. Now, obviously, from an ethno point of view, that's naive. Really, it's not what happens because you're using a word deliberately to create some images of terribleness in people's minds, but you're trying to deny it at the same time.
Well, here's and I think we tried to put these things into little buckets, and it's really tough. Real quickly, I do want to bring up Brad's comment because I think this shows the as the Buddhists might say, the middle way quite well. That basically saying that it was a Holocaust analogy that impacted Brad in a big way, and but also that despite this, that it perhaps isn't, well, using Brad's words, it's that it's not effective because of the opportunity cost potential to have the conversation derailed. To be honest, I don't think anyone knows the rate of derailing compared to the rate of adding an extra punch through the use of the word, which really does gesture at the whole question here, because the next section is all about the potential risks, and can we actually mitigate those risks to the point where we can focus in on the effectiveness, without derailing.
Well, I think Brad's point is really interesting because it's very nuanced, because he's kind of saying this had a big impact on me, but in the fullness of light kind of thing. Interesting that he mentions Jurowski, because the people that I've seen crediting Holocaust as being the turning point in their thinking was from the famous Jurowski talk. So there's been a few. The interesting point there is on a kind of social psychological level, it could well be that the likes of Brad here and those people who had kind of finally tipped by watching the Jurowski talk were on the way to veganism anyway. They're kind of in that kind of ballpark of getting there, and so other things would have done the trick, in other words. So rather than watching other things, you could watch Dominion, or rather than reading this book, you might read another, and you kind of get there in the end. That what I'm trying to say, not very well, is that the thing that is kind of put up as the kind of crucial factor might not actually be that. It's just that, like you say, it's what people remember. I remember watching that, and I was a vegan afterwards, and this kind of stuff, right? And I think we're talking about a complicated thing about human kind of almost like remembrance, because you kind of like we all get these questions, when did you go vegan? Why did you go vegan? You're thinking back, aren't you? Kind of, oh, why was that? Oh yeah, it was that Jurowski talk, right? You get that a lot, and then you go, what? So you weren't a vegan before that, and you were after that? Oh no, that's not what I meant. So it's much
again, it's a piece in the puzzle, though. That doesn't mean it's not effective.
What? No.
It's still a piece in the puzzle. Just because it's a piece instead of the whole puzzle doesn't necessarily mean it's not effective.
Well, it's a question that you can see it as one building block, which didn't necessarily have to be there. So you can't claim it as a crucial thing. But I'm not denying it was there in their jigsaw, if you like. I'm not denying that at all.
So it was effective then, if it's in the puzzle and it helps move them towards veganism.
Well, all I'm saying is
that's the definition of effectiveness, isn't it?
Well, I think a lot of people, what they tend to do is they put a lot of weight for various reasons on certain things, and they make a kind of claim, and I suspect perhaps kind of exaggerated, because they've got a point to make within this thing. I mean, let's face it, like a lot of people at the moment are using this resurfacing of this debate and this discourse as a way of having a go at intersectionals. I mean,
maybe we can stick on effectiveness just for the purposes of, we're gonna have a whole freestyle. I mean, I don't know. It sounds like you're maybe saying it's effective, but a piece of the bigger puzzle. Is that? I'm just trying to keep on that, because I think it's an important question to ask. Effective for whom? Because one of the big expressions we hear when we think of human atrocities is, and specifically the Jewish Holocaust, is never again. And I can't help but wonder if actually discussing about this, if people really click, and I appreciate it. I think part of the reason for this discussion is that it's really tricky to get people to click that we're trying to lift other animals up. We're not trying to pull certain humans down. It's tricky, but if we can do that, isn't that going to put us a long way towards being effective, not just at stopping what happens to other animals, but also our fellow humans?
I'm not sure about that. I mean,
isn't that the whole premise behind entanglement theory?
What you mean?
Maybe I'm taking us off piece now, but that's me one of the core tenets of.
As we gain knowledge about one thing, we transfer it in terms of critical theory to something else. Well, yeah, if that's what you mean, then that's right. Yeah.
So by not using the analogy, we're actually losing the opportunity to do this. Now, in the next section, I think we'll explore more what the risks are and how to mitigate them potentially, which maybe without help. I mean, I think Jacob has a good point about analogies, that they can be used to water down the message. However, I would say that's actually one of the more effective tools I know I found I use, and just a specific example that may not be directly the Holocaust analogy, but just asking people, have you had any, other animals, dogs, cats, or other animals in your life? And if I can get them telling a story about them, they more often than not see them as individuals, and then asking, well, what about chickens? What about turkeys? And starting to see them all as unique individuals. I think analogies have a lot of weight when we use them in that type of fashion. Do you use analogies on street outreach at all? Maybe this is a bit more of a general point.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody does that. I mean, I'm not familiar with what Jake is talking about here in terms of this particular research. I mean that's an interesting one. But again, we've also, I mean, in this entire conversation, we've got to allow for the fact we are talking about case by case as well. And as always with the social movement context, you've got this terrible problem that what might be very effective for one person might be the very thing that turns them off of the other person. It's just that you don't know which one, and so
I was going to say that's a key point to this, isn't it? Are we actually, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've really challenged my own speciesism through pondering this discussion. Because actually, what is the reason for not using that analogy? Because if we're going to use it for similar human atrocities, I don't know if you've agreed, but at least I've come to the conclusion that the intent being different isn't enough to dismiss the similarities. So why actually do we object to it? Maybe that's the risk section that's coming up next.
No, you're saying what is the reason for not using the analogy? You've got to have a bloody good reason for using it, given the controversy that is associated with it. Surely,
would 99% of the population rejecting our message and 3 trillion unique individuals being killed annually be a pretty damn good reason to use strong words tactfully?
Well, I'm not opposed to using strong words or putting your point of view in a forceful manner and a direct manner, and clarity is the key to all those things. That's not the issue, but it's just that given the fact that we've got so many ways of articulating the case for animal rights, we then, if we want to use analogies, we ought to really make sure that we're using the ones that are the best, and not the ones that are going to take us down. I mean, going back to this thing about not alienating people, not blocking them, not shutting them out. As soon as you do that, you're not doing what you're there on the street, for example, to do, which is to talk to them about the case for animal rights. And so the danger I see of the Holocaust analogy and the rape thing and the slavery thing is you're creating a big question mark in people's minds, and they're no longer listening to you anymore. They're more like thinking, did he say that? Did he say? It creates an issue where you can easily derail the conversation. And I'd suggest that we've done that here. We haven't talked about the analogy. I mean, we're too busy talking about the definition and is it actually accurate?
Well, that's because we're both animal advocates. We're not, know your audience. We're discussing the strategy. We could do a mock conversation if we wanted to maybe talk about some ways we could work into a conversation. Maybe that's something we do down the line if we feel that would be helpful.
No, I think I think what happened between us as two animal advocates is what would happen on the street as well. You'd end up with that derailment, and you'd end up with a large section of the talk being about clarifying terms and everything. So
I'm not sure what the answer though. If it's not speciesism, why not use the analogy?
I'm not saying not to.
We're talking about speciesism. Sorry to jump in, but if we're talking about speciesism, we're talking about what we need to talk about.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. We wouldn't be talking about speciesism. You'd be talking about what Holocaust are you talking about? What
hang on. You said we're not talking about it, but we are talking about it.
No, you're talking about the definition and all that about what people understand as Holocaust.
Well, but if someone doesn't have a response of why it's not speciesism, to use an analogy, like, let's talk about that. Like, that's what we're here to do today. But what is that reason? That to me is the thrust of it.
Well,
Which maybe we're getting ahead to the next section around the risks.
I'm not sure about getting ahead. I think we're talking past each other. I'm just trying to suggest that as kind of our job, our task, is to put over the case for animal rights. We then have to, and we do know that just hearing about the case for animal rights is challenging enough. The less that we put in there that's going to derail our chances of getting our message over seems to me something that we ought to spend a lot of time thinking about. And you almost like think, is it worth throwing that in there for the benefit as we perceive it versus the downside? I think it's a balance.
Well, there's 2 points I'd like to say on that. One is probably a future debate, but one, I would say an overemphasis on rights could be a distraction, which I appreciate. I'm just lobbing a grenade out there. That's a lot to unpack with that. I mean, to me, the focus is on language. But if we work within that paradigm that we do need to talk about rights, why not do rights-based Holocaust analogies if we're to use the analogy to address your point? Was that not mass rights violations?
Well, we could do that. It's a question of what's going to happen if we do.
Well, I think we need to tell stories to people, don't we? Because when people think about a Holocaust, they think about something pretty damn bad, like, for lack of a better expression. So if we can somehow get them to think about that in an animal-centric way,
I
that
don't
makes it effective to me.
But it's not true, though.
What's not true?
Well, they don't think of something damn bad. They think of the Jewish Holocaust, which is something damn bad.
Wait. Okay, thank you. All right. I thought you were saying something you weren't.
No. So
they are thinking about something bad. That's my point.
Yeah, that's right. And then, then you're almost like inviting them. I mean, that depending on their knowledge of the Holocaust, that you're then inviting them to make that analogy to them going into the supermarket, to buy some animal flesh. And this is where it starts to kind of jar, I think, in people's minds, because I don't think it's doing its job, really. I mean, I think that we should describe what we do to other animals. And I mean, that's another issue, isn't it? But the thing is, it's one thing for us to say Holocaust, but I mean, if they say it in their mind, well, that's not too bad. It's the same as, I mean, I feel this very strongly in the rape case, that if you describe artificial insemination and they think in their mind, blimey, that sounds like rape, well, that's fine and dandy. That's different from us saying that artificial insemination is the same as rape, because just as in the human Holocaust, and which involves things like the rapes that you talked about, and just like in artificial insemination, when it's humans doing it to humans, there's a heck of a lot more going on. That's not diminishing what happens to the other animals, because that stands on its own, as far as I'm concerned, and that we should be able to talk about it on its own.
Well, here's something. So this is a fascinating thing I came across recently, that I think maybe would be my last point for the effectiveness perspective. I learned recently that gay rights activists actually used analogies to the civil rights movement to help bring a bit of context to their struggle. How would you feel about that analogy when we're focusing on the similarities versus, obviously done tactfully, which I think is a theme throughout this discussion? Do you think that's helpful?
Well, the thing is, you seem to be kind of framing me now as somebody who's totally opposed to analogies.
Well, that is what it's about, though, if it's appropriate to use or not.
We're talking about the Holocaust analogy.
Yeah, and I'm using a flip it to test it, human on human analogy. Is it okay to use an analogy there? Because if the answer is no, if the answer is yes, that it's okay, then what are we talking about other than speciesism?
You'd have to tell me the details. I mean, why would they make that analogy? What was the purpose of it? See,
because we're moving things along. I don't know I'm sure you've seen the charts where we talk about the struggles of various minoritized groups and how, like, okay, women, black folks, and so on, how we're progressively making our way through the list, and there's a lot of work to do in all the categories, but that we're I think it's fair to say that we're further ahead on some than others. And this analogy was because at this point, gay rights was just coming to prominence in the sense where civil rights was further along. So by drawing the comparisons between the two, it got some people thinking, which is kind of the whole point.
Yeah, well, it might have worked in that, but I mean, the question to you is, if you seem to think that in certain occasions, given times, whatever the parameters that you want to talk about, that the analogy is useful and effective. But in my thought about that is that if I'm thinking about the kind of conversations that I have with people, I'm not quite sure where you would then suddenly go bring in the Holocaust suddenly, because I've spoken to a few people over the last week about, can you remember talking about the Holocaust on the street? You know, I mean, have you ever talked to people about the Holocaust? When would you do it? Start off with that, or, you know, if things were flagging, you bring in the. I mean, where is talking about the Jewish Holocaust, which is what people will think in their mind? We know that. Where does that help create the case for human rights?
This is, I think we're kind of moving into the risks here, which just if I can just do a quick housekeeping, we're reasonably keeping the time. So I think if we were just to move along to the risk side of things, and just a note for those who have joined us, we will be doing an open mic session, which we're running a bit behind schedule, but you know, sometime in that, in this region here, you'll have your chance to come on and share your own views. That math I don't think is working out correctly. Anyway, to your point, and I think this moves us into the risk section nicely, because I think the way that I would bring it up is in a way to encourage people to use their own words. So if this was happening to humans, what would we call it? That's how I think we can bring it up. But the thing is, and one might say, well, that's not using an analogy. Sorry?
You mean hint at it rather than say it?
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I think that this isn't meant to sidestep the question, because I think the thing is, some people won't go there. So, I mean, then it's a matter of us as advocates, how much we want to gesture and nudge people in that direction. But to me, if we can get people to use their own words, we're probably going to arrive at a similar conclusion. Probably get a chance to talk about the speciesism in our language, which I think is a phenomenally important discussion because that shapes how we view our fellow animals.
Do you think that you're not capable of articulating the case for animal rights without getting people to consider that, you know, everything I've just said now, if that was happening to humans, what would you call it, and all that kind of stuff? That just talking about the rights violation against other animals is not enough?
I'm not sure that's a complete comparison, because yes, I've been an animal advocate for years, and I don't think I've ever used the analogy. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not appropriate.
Well, it's obviously not necessary if you've never used it.
Stuff can be appropriate, but not necessary.
Well, the thing is, given all the risks associated with using it, what's the point?
Well, maybe let's dive into that, because that is a key part of the conversation that's been gestured at, is the moral shock, as we've described it, worth the potential derailment. So do you want to, I mean, maybe we talk about the difference between offense versus harm, because I think that's been a key thing that's been discussed.
Yeah, I don't think it's interesting that, because yeah, I mean, I've been watching a couple of live streams and a couple of videos and everything, and everybody focuses on offense. The only problem with talking about that is that more fits with ableist terms. Maybe the rape discourse fits more with this. It's kind of more difficult to actually suggest that you're actually creating harm by talking about the Holocaust analogy. I mean, yeah. I think part of it is probably because it's kind of so long ago in a way. I mean, this is a little bit cloudy in my mind, folks, here, but it seems to me that whenever I've known people ask other people not to use certain analogies and certain words, it's because of the harm it's causing them, not because they've taken offense. Whether that translates to the Holocaust, though, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if there's a kind of, as it were, a young person who is actually harmed. But I mean, there's certainly people who have been sexually assaulted. They've been called all kinds of ableist words. And so when you use ableist words and they ask you not to, and you insist on using them, you're not just offending them, you're actually harming them. In fact, for some people, you're bringing their sexual assault back to them. It's like taking them back into court and saying, okay, what happened to you, love? Right? It's a very damaging thing to do. And I think that a lot of people tend to minimize it by calling it, some people don't like to be offended, do they? No, it's not that. It's that people don't want to be harmed. And more than that, we shouldn't want to harm anyone. Why would we?
Yeah, and I think that's a strong point. And I think on both sides of the spectrum, there's, it is harm. It's not offense that is being talked about is on that end of the spectrum. Juxtaposed to, I think everyone's not racist and anti-Semitic that uses it. I think that those are the two ends of the spectrum. To me, I do think we need, for all of us, regardless of where we fall on this issue, knowledge about harm is important. Just to draw an analogy, I know that's familiar to me, and I suspect a lot of people who are with us right now. Graphic footage. When I see it on my screen, I do a lot of editing with very graphic stuff, but I don't expose myself to it unless I think it's going to help my animal advocacy. And it's not because I'm offended. It's because, to your point, it harms me. Like it literally is bringing back all those memories of both animals in real life and footage and the rest of it. And I think that is a risk to navigate with this analogy. Now, I think maybe we could talk through two potential scenarios, because to me, the key one is, at the moment, given we're all pretty much locked up in our houses, is social media. So if we're going to use that as a umbrella to discuss this risk of harming, what do we do? To me, the answer is a content warning. Now, for anybody thinking like, oh, content warning, what are those, and a bit resistant to it, I think, to me, I see them acting as a bit of a funnel that can simultaneously shield those, including our fellow animal advocates, that will negatively impact their mental health. Because let's talk about burnout. People burn out constantly in the animal rights movement, and that's a serious issue that I think we all should take seriously. So, like, why not? Why not? But then on the flip side, for people who aren't familiar with these issues, they see a content warning. I don't know if anybody else has done this in the chat or that's here with us, but sometimes I've seen a content warning and I'm like, what the heck is that? What does that even mean? And I actually look, it's actually a catalyst for me to look at the post, or people to scroll past and look at it anyway. So what would be really interesting to me, sorry?
That's getting a little bit into, I mean, I mentioned the fact that I4 came up, International Fund for Animal Welfare came up in when we were chatting online. And I mentioned the fact that in the 1980s, when it used to be that they used to put out these big shiny leaflets because they focused on the Canadian seal cull. So, the kind of white coat pups and all that kind of stuff, Bridget Bardot and all that kind of stuff. And what they would do is they would fold these leaflets into a little booklet. And the front of the booklet was, don't open this, shocking images and this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, that's a strong case for us all to consider content warnings, in my view.
Because
and I'm not saying this fully addresses the issue, but I think it's a big part of it, particularly when we're looking at online content. Well, back to your example. I think a lot of these issues, when we're looking at the darkest sides of humanity and, quite frankly, the darkest side of ourselves, we have to go to some pretty dark places. And the question is, should we avoid going to those dark places? Because to me, like, we need to talk about these things to prevent them happening in the future. And this is beyond analogies. So while there is harm that's done, how do we navigate these harm-producing topics?
Let me say something which is of a very kind of personal level, but it's kind of it feeds into a lot of things we said here, because it's kind of case by case in a way. A lot of people in the chat, and some of you, obviously in the animal rights team, I'm a rape survivor myself, but when people talk about artificial insemination in terms of rape, I don't think, it doesn't seem to create offense in me or harm. I don't think, unless it's on a subconscious level that I'm not really registering. So I think it's like a case by case thing. And I think in relation to trigger warnings, you're just kind of like trying to alert people to the possibility that if they've got particular sensibilities about certain things, then maybe this is not where they want to go, type of thing. But that doesn't mean that if they did go there, it would create any problems. So it's a case by case thing, and this. But again, in terms of offense, harm, I mean, like causing harm is a lot worse than causing offense. I think that's a given. I think everybody would agree with that. In fact, we don't kind of have a right not to be offended, but we certainly have a right not to be harmed. And so the idea of causing harm versus causing offense, it's a kind of no-brainer. Which one you don't do,
And the movement's not really even talking about harm. And yeah, I think it goes without saying. Thank you for sharing that. Because you're right. Every situation's individual, and that's tough. I mean, it's a challenge with outreach in general. We've got to, obviously we've got our opening questions maybe, but every interaction's different. So yeah, I think maybe that is something with the risk category that is in the favor of not using it, because if we're just throwing them out there without any tact, I think that is
but
difficult to justify.
Ironically, Jeremy, of the three issues that we've talked about, I think it doesn't apply as much to Holocaust to the other things.
Because it's more generational secondary trauma versus primary direct trauma? Like PTSD versus STSD, kind of?
Yeah, something like that. I mean, I think it's something to do with that. It kind of must be. It's kind of, I mean, I don't know whether it's to do with the distance or something, about how long ago. But I mean, you mentioned the Seb Alex thing. And it's very clear that Seb is still very much affected by the Armenian Holocaust and what it meant to his family, and in particular, his grandmother, and people that he knew who had been assaulted and this kind of stuff. It obviously, it was still something that's really, really meaningful to him.
And it's still going on today, right?
Yeah. Well,
he was talking about knowing friends that were, involved anyway. But
yeah, I mean, male rape is still going on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have that kind of effect on me. So it's a complex thing. I mean, we talk about we're complicated animals, human beings, and I just think, going back to my original statement, that we've got to be careful, at least thoughtful, about what we talk about and when and how and why. And I don't think the case has been made for the analogy, and the fact that you don't even use it, I think, weakens your case.
I think to me, I'm not sure if that's a fair extrapolation, because I have very specific advocacy. Sharing most of the work I do is supporting a sanctuary, and I'm very mindful of not going outside of their comfort zone for how they want to present, the survivors who live at their sanctuary. I mean, that's a fundamental part of my advocacy. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say, hey, Jeremy, you didn't use the analogy in your, video with Rosie the cow.
I mean, you could say,
so it's not a fair analogy to use. I think,
the funny thing was, people have used the analogy with the Underground Railroad, with the ALF, for example. So I mean, you could characterize the other animals in sanctuaries as ones who have escaped from or been rescued from a Holocaust, if you wanted to.
Well, funnily enough, I know someone who, key person in the sanctuary world, that says if we weren't, if the animal situation weren't going on, we'd probably be, hiding the Jews. So there's definitely some overlap there. I mean, just so we don't go too far off, I mean, I think the other common situation, which I think we kind of talked about earlier, but in a live situation, I mean, what do you think about just asking someone, what would we call this? Do you think that helps mitigate the risk from a live situation, if we're looking at it from social media content warnings and now talking about live interactions?
Well, I certainly think that's obviously going to be a more nuanced way of entering into that area of discourse, if you wanted to. And so it was almost like asking for informed consent, or almost, perhaps. But I mean, that's certainly different from hitting them with a picture, house switch on one side and a factory farm on the other. which is obviously been done in the past in the movement, that you've made that direct comparison.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, if you just say, well, I mean, like, just think if this was happening to humans, what we'd call it. Well, that's an invitation for them to speculate, I suppose. That's certainly different from saying this is a Holocaust.
Well, and I think that the if I understand the issue reasonably fairly, I think the key objection to the analogy is the harm it causes. So we've talked about content warnings for social media. We've talked about leading people to use their own words versus just throwing them at them and providing the context of raising other animals up, not dehumanizing certain groups. The third point would be, I think it's essential that we're consistent. If we're saying this is really bad, but then denying that it exists, for instance, in the context of racism, I think we kind of lose the strength of the analogy. If we're saying, yeah, it's just like what you go through, but you're not going through it. To me, that's and I'm just generalizing here. I think we've got to be consistent in our application. If we're going to talk about human issues, we've got to be prepared to where that takes us. Did that point come across reasonably well, or are you getting lost in the comments? There's a lot going on there, I saw.
I think
You're like, I've had enough time talking to this Jerry guy.
yeah. Let's open it up, folks. I mean, we're late for doing that. We ought to go to open mic, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're nearly there. I mean, do we just want to? Because my thought is, just so we're not too messy with the debate, try to avoid the messy debate takeaway. Do we just some closing thoughts and final poll and then open mic? That sounds pretty good to me.
Well, that's be very, very, very quick final thoughts. My final thoughts are very quick in the sense that, I mean, I'm not totally opposed to raising it in the nuanced way that you've talked about it. I just think that as a general matter, that we as claims makers, this is a key to it. We are educators. We therefore need to speak to other humans in a way that we clarify what we mean, and we're trying to get people on the other animal's side by accepting a set of propositions. And from a rights-based point of view, as we know, it's that other animals are rights bearers and that our use of them are rights violations. That is our task, to kind of get people to consider that in their head. I don't want to put anything else in their head that's going to kind of knock that primary task out. That's all. I mean, I think if you're gonna kind of introduce something that's going to completely go whoa, then what's the point? Find another way.
Yeah, and I think we don't want to be too hyperbolic on either side of this things. In the same way, I think we shouldn't be telling people it's off limits. I also don't think we should be saying we have to use it. So absolutely, there's lots of ways that we can reach people about this issue. Just, I mean, if I were to put together, I mean, the key things I would really take away from this is there's an obvious need to use strong language if we can do it tactfully. I mean, we could do a whole other topic if we're making progress. Hang on, closing statements. Sorry, what is it? What is it? I'll stop. Derail the closing statements.
No, it's just that you're in danger of equating strong language with those have to use this word, and that's not the case. I mean,
that's an incomplete comparison. I'm not suggesting use this strong word. I'm saying this is a strong word that we could consider using.
Yeah, well,
and I think if we and this is my closing statement. Maybe we can. We've got an open mic we can always go to. But I mean, to me,
I don't care about your closing statement.
I can mute you if I want to.
I know you could do. But one last thing for me, I've seen a lot of activists. They're making videos, and they're almost like going, look, kind of, I like this word. I'm going to use this word. Fuck you type attitude, right? Now, I would say to them, nobody can stop you using it, but I would like you to consider why you want to so apparently desperately to use that. I mean, it's being called things like language policing, this kind of stuff. I mean, it's interesting. I was watching a live stream, and they were complaining about language policing, and then somebody alluded to the N word, and the person complaining about language policing suddenly said, "Well, hang on a minute, we can't be saying that." So we've all got places that we don't want to go to, and there's got to be good reasons why we go to places, and what effect that has in our experience.
Yeah, I think mindfulness, most of us hopefully can agree we can all be more mindful and continue to be as advocates. I mean, to me, I think as it keeps coming up, it's that balance between the potential effectiveness and the potential harm. I think we've talked about some ways to mitigate the harm. I think social media content warnings, which I think actually is an effective tool even to get people to click on it, as discussed earlier. Having live discussions and simultaneously kind of nudging them to use their own words while simultaneously being mindful to redirect if you're getting some strong resistance.
I think what worries me.
But you're completely derailing this whole. We had this whole spreadsheet: closing statements, opening statements. You're fine with the opening statements, but all right, one more, because otherwise it's gonna be 20 minutes till we get to the open mic.
I think it was the open mic by now. I get the impression that the impression I get sometimes from watching some of the activist videos that I've seen over the last week is that they're almost like suggesting. I mean, they're obviously upset that these words are being taken away from them in some way, which can't actually happen in the first place. But it's as though they're suggesting that these are the best words to use, and almost like implying that these are the only words you can use to describe this situation. And I just would like.
I find that's a completely disingenuous claim. I don't think anybody's saying it's the only words. They're just saying it's a strong word. Sure, we can do other things. Both of us do, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a strong word. Otherwise, there wouldn't be all this controversy, right? I mean, that's part of it. I appreciate there's the harm that we have to tactfully navigate, but I think
we have to deconstruct that. Is it strong because it's strong, or is it strong because it's controversial? I think that those are two different aspects to it. I mean, like it's a very
entangled, though. Surely,
it's a politically charged, correct thing, isn't it? And like. We're entering that thing, and we kind of know. You kind of know that if you throw that kind of pebble into the pond, you're going to create waves. And it's a question of is it worth it? I guess we have to.
Which pebble do we throw? And I think for those who use the analogy, they feel that's the most effective pebble to throw.
Well,
I'm not advocating for one position or another, but if we go back to the question,
Well, going back to what you said about rights, and I understand that people that could be a bit derailing, but that's what I want to talk about: animal rights. So that's the pebble that I would throw more than I'd throw the Holocaust analogy, because the rights one is the one that I actually want to talk about. Not okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think one last go at my closing statement. I one more, and I'm gonna. I want to be respectful, but I will mute you. But yeah, I honestly think there's a number of questions we have to ask ourselves around this scenario, and a few of the ones that I've asked myself is, do we think it's accurate? And I think if we focus on the similarities versus the differences, for the most part, it is. When we're talking about mass killing from a victim's perspective. Do we think it's appropriate to call other human, non-Jewish atrocities Holocausts? And then, also, do we think, slavery and other analogies can be appropriate? Referring to abolition, for example. And then do we think that content warnings, leading people to use their own words, and consistently applying these ideas throughout our advocacy could actually mitigate some of the harm and actually help prevent these, I'm beyond words to try to describe the atrocities we're discussing, help prevent them from happening to both humans and our fellow animals? Because to me, if you've answered yes to any of these questions in the spirit of consistent anti-speciesism, we really should answer yes to the question that animal advocates can use the Holocaust analogy and that it's appropriate when done tactfully. So in the spirit of the animal rights show, I'd really like to close with a short quote that a huge inspiration for the show, Tom Reagan, originator of non-rhetorical animal rights, which really, when thinking about how we use our language and using words that has teeth to it, it makes me think of this quote, which is that moral truth is often extreme, and it must be. For when injustice is absolute, one must oppose it absolutely. And I think we should oppose it with our language.
And just on the language of what you were saying just then, Jeremy, when you said that animal advocates can use it, I mean, obviously, we can't stop them using it. The real question is, should, isn't it? Ought they?
Well, and now I think we're kind of at the tail end. We'll get the open mic going soon here in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if you do want to join us on screen, you're welcome, or we'll start prioritizing all the text-based comments. The wording was a struggle. I mean, even the word appropriate, what does that even mean? I mean, sometimes it probably is appropriate to use the analogy, and sometimes maybe it isn't. So I think...
So what
Should we go to the poll?
What do we do? Do we put the link in the chat or what?
Nudge, nudge. Yeah, all right.
You want to do the final poll, or do you want to do the open mic first?
I think we might lose people. Let's do the final poll, and then that kind of puts a bit of a bookend on our discussion.
He loves his polls, folks.
Find the tab here. All right, so this should be, with any luck, the closing poll. So if anybody can go to their chat, if you are on a mobile device, you might have to flick back to this after you vote. It's just one simple question. Is the analogy appropriate? Yes, no, and we'll see the results here in about a minute or so. And we will be measuring this by shift, so I have to do some quick numbers into the spreadsheet for that purpose.
Please remember, only one vote per person. How many votes do you get, Jeremy?
We actually we're only 15 minutes behind schedule. I think we did pretty darn good for navigating a complex topic with a lot of nuances. So let's see here. We do have lots of responses coming in. 24 responses out of 59. So I'll give it another 20, 30 seconds for those who may have just been clicking on the link, may have just seen it. And then we will pull it up here.
I'm not quite sure we did very well. Maybe we should start again.
starting to navigate. Damage control, as was said in the last debate, wasn't it? So start was 50. 19.
I love to see
All right.
cogs going round there, Jeremy.
There's hopefully one or two cogs knocking around there still. So let's pull up. I'll close off the responses. We're at 36 closing responses, and here we go. This is, yeah, so it looks like a lot of people possibly held to their view, which is kind of to be expected.
The check's in the post from Jeremy.
So if I can just, so the ending numbers.
Thing is, like you say about language, is it acceptable? That's one thing, but is it wise is another, isn't it?
Well, there's so many different ways you could frame this question. So many different ways. 33.3. Oh, that's not. Feel free to tell your favorite vegan joke in the meantime. We could all do a bit of humor with this dark topic, I reckon. I'll pull up the comparison in just a moment.
My favorite joke is 5 words long, as you know.
All right, and we'll get this back over. And
Elliot said, I don't think Roger's view was ever no. Well, I don't think your view was ever completely yes either, was it? So
there's nuances, and that's the thing. I mean, we're kind of putting this as a slight discussion, but you know, hey, I mean, according to the results, you had a bigger shift. More of the unsures, it looked like, moved to your camp.
it's not scientifically valid, Jeremy. Don't worry about it. I mean,
I mean, we could look at relative shift, but looking at absolute shift, I think either way, it'd still have come out. So that's really interesting. So exploring this idea, it seems like more are leaning towards it. It's not appropriate. But I mean, perhaps we could have used a bit more of a closed versus open question in the sense of, is it ever appropriate? Would be probably yield different results.
Yeah, you haven't counted the postal votes, have you?
Yeah, I need to start calling everybody I'm seeing in the chat like, hey, can you just give me one more vote? I need 5 votes. Just like there's a certain recorded conversation of a politician who did that, isn't there, recently?
A politician? No, you're stretching it now. Paul wants to know my favorite joke, which is only 5 words long. My favorite joke of all time is, I've got to get this right. Masochist, hit me. Sadist, no. That's it.
We'll let you break that down in the chat. Oh, all right. Should we just invite people to join us and just free flow comments to the chat? Because I apologize, I've been more engrossed with the live conversation.
Yeah, let's bring people on. Let's bring people on, and also, split the people up. The people on can go for the questions as well. So why not? This is open.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is our first ever time, at least on the Animal Rights Show, I believe, doing an open mic. So we figured why not pick one of the most controversial topics and experiment with that at the same time. But here we go. So that should come across all 3 platforms. The way StreamYard works is it basically works in your browser if you haven't used it before. Yeah. And if you're in the chat, if you do want to have a specific point to raise, if you could just start it with a Q and ideally frame it as a bit of a question, and then we'll address the text-based thoughts that way if we've missed anything. I'm curious to hear what people's thoughts are. Is anyone surprised that more of the unsures went to no versus yes? Because I guess maybe that makes sense from an ethno perspective, because if you're unsure, that probably means you're hesitant to be able to use it without causing harm. So you're probably more likely to swerve it. But the room's quite split. If we look at, basically 50-50 versus use it or not. No wonder it's such a big controversy.
I know you're making a serious point, but I want to answer Michelle. I won't give up my day job, Michelle. In fact, I used to teach the sociology of humor, but I'm really bad at telling jokes.
All right, so we have our first question. Lavinia is asking, I'd like to ask how we build a diverse and inclusive animal rights movement when AR activists continue to use divisive and often hurtful language that can cause harm for minority communities and people who have experienced trauma, particularly in group actions. Yeah. I agree. And I guess it's a tough one. I think when it comes to language, we should always strive for respectful language. I mean, if we bring it back to the Holocaust analogy, is the Holocaust word in and of itself inherently harmful? Maybe can we mitigate it? I don't know. A lot of words can cause harm, can't they? So, looks like we have our first guest panelist. Welcome, Ronnie. How are you feeling?
Oh no, you haven't got any decent for people, have you? What's going on here?
So we do have an open mic session, so we'll keep this running for a fair bit, just so everybody can share their views on the topic.
You'd have to put indecent person.
Oh, blimey, I've got to do a show with you on Wednesday. I've had enough already.
Do it now.
You'll have to do an advert, Ronnie. But going to the question, I'd like to think, because this is a very important movement question. A lot of people say things like, I want everybody, all types of people, wherever they're from, whatever their views are, I want them in the movement. But you've got to accept and acknowledge that if you get people with oppressive views in a justice-based movement, then people who are threatened by that are going to leave, and so that's going to skew the movement to kind of bring in a lot more people with the kind of views that seem to be antithetical to the values of the movement itself, because you're actually driving out people from the movement by bringing in just everybody, regardless of how oppressive their views are. Now, okay, that involves gatekeeping, language policing, and all that. But if we do want a diverse and inclusive movement, then we've got to be able to talk to each other in a good way, in a respectful way. And if the thing is, well, oh, sod all that, I'll just say what I want, regardless of who I harm, then you're not going to grow your movement. You're going to actually slim it down, or more, anything. It's going to tip the balance. And politically, as we know, it means we go from left to right.
I'd say for all of us, when we use language, we have to be mindful of when we use the words. A simple thing I just realized, actually from last week's live stream, is we use words and we expect that both speakers mean the same thing when we use those words, but that's not often the case. So actually just asking, oh, I noticed you used this word. What does that word mean to you? I think can clear up a lot of this confusion, but also being mindful of the potential harm. What do you reckon, Ronnie? Is this chat shifted your view on the topic at all?
No, not really. I mean, it's not something I use in outreach, because in outreach, I think you're talking to that individual person about the effect they're going to have as an individual by going vegan, and you're talking about the animals they're going to spare personally by going vegan. In other words, that if they continue to consume animals, that's over 100 a year, they're creating a demand for over 100 a year animals to be killed. And so by going vegan, they're not doing that. So it's kind of more down to individual animals, more down to what that person can do as an individual. So I don't really see how talking about the Holocaust would be appropriate in that situation. It's something I've never done. Well, I have used it is in more sort of political and philosophical discussions with people, not on the street, more online, talking about the actual true situation of human oppression of other animals. And just how extensive and how bad that is. That's kind of where I've kind of maybe used the word Holocaust with a small h. And I think there's a lot of comparisons to be made between how the human species treats other animals and how the Nazis treated other humans they considered to be inferior, because it's all about supremacism. It's all about supremacism. And so this was what happened because of supremacism. Between one group of humans and another, and that's comparable to what occurs to other animals because of human supremacism.
Yeah. I mean, I think Wendy's got a question here. Let me just see if I can scroll up to it. Just around, I mean, I'm not sure people are. I'll just go ahead and read it. I'm not sure non-vegans, I'm sure non-vegans are offended by the word vegan, as they're forced to think about their actions towards animals. Should we stop using the word vegan? I mean, I think I'm not sure it's very analogous, because Holocaust, vegan obviously have a whole lot different things wrapped up in them. But I do think all of our words, being mindful of the potential interpretations they have, we've got to think about when we're using them. Otherwise, why use them?
How would you be offended by the word vegan?
Well, all the little jokes, all found the vegan and all this stuff. Like, even if someone asks us a question, even if we're just answering their question, it's like, oh, there goes the vegan again talking about veganism. That's part about vegan. That's part about offense, isn't it?
And that would offend you?
Well, it's a confronting topic. I don't know if the word vegan necessarily would do it in and of itself, but well, I mean, it kind of segues to Sumaya's question. Apologize about the name pronunciation, but if we can't measure the impact of using certain terms, but we know it can potentially be negative, is it in our movement's best interest to still use them at all? I'll confess that's how I started out my animal advocacy.
Well, the answer was provided. The strong answer was provided by Grumpy Vegan Grandad, and also Vegan Pixie Warrior. This idea that if we consider what the other animals would want to say, of course, there's no way of knowing that actually, but that's an often a position that's put up, isn't it? That what words would I don't know if you found that. Do you want me to give you a time on that one? No, it's a Grumpy Vegan Grandad one.
Oh, on a specifically comment. I was just going to say, building on the vegan offense thing.
Yeah, this
Someone
is
who does know.
6:46.
6:46. Yeah, time is very helpful because there's a lot of comments. Thank you everyone who contributed to the chat. So Grumpy 6:46. I'm not seeing a Grumpy 6:40. Oh, here it is. So what words would the animals use if they could speak about what is happening to them? And just dropping the link again. If anybody doesn't want to join the live chat, you're welcome to. Just doing a bit of an open mic. Or you can do a text-based question.
My answer to that is I think that they would say, I don't want my rights to be violated, and more over, I would like the movement that it's supposed to be talking about my interest to talk about my rights instead of cruelty to me. That's what they'd say.
The thing is, not people wouldn't say that though, would they, Roger? Like if you say to a person, you know, why is it that you know, what's the problem with what's been done to you? A person would say, well, I don't like it that my rights are being violated. That's not the way a person, even a human, would speak about the oppression that's being done to them, is it? That's not how ordinary people speak.
That's a strong point.
Well, actually, I've heard you say that point before, but I think so. I think some would, and obviously, then you've also got, we're into the difficult territory of legal versus moral rights there, and I think the strongest point is that they don't actually say my negative rights are being violated. I understand that they don't put it that way, but I think human rights advocates would. They talk about human rights violations. They talk about human rights abuses.
They do, but that's not people we meet in the street. When somebody comes up to the stall in the street, they're not a human rights advocate. They're an ordinary member of the public that uses ordinary language that ordinary people use, and you have to use the same language.
We're not talking about them. We're talking about the other animals here. Grumpy's asking, what would the other animals say?
Well, if we want people to connect with other animals as if they would connect with humans, shouldn't we, to Ronnie's point, shouldn't we use language that gets them to connect with them on a animal-centric level through a human lens? If that makes sense?
I'm not talking on that level at all. I'm just trying to answer Grumpy Vegan Granddad's question, and I would suggest, because obviously, what this question is, it's about what I want the animals to say, isn't it? I mean, like, as a rights-based person, I want the animals to say, don't violate my rights, because that's the way I like to frame these issues. I mean, other people would want the animals to say, I'm going through a Holocaust, stop it. Other people would say, the other animals want to say, don't be cruel to me.
But we want the other animals to say the thing that was most likely to have an effect of people no longer wanting to oppress them. Isn't that what we want them to say if they're speaking to ordinary people?
Do people talk about oppression like that about themselves as well, Ronnie?
No, I don't think they do, but I'm saying that the animals no longer want to be oppressed. So what would they say to people in order to get people to no longer be part of that? What language would they use? And they'd need to use language that ordinary people would understand and would relate to. Like you wouldn't like it if this was done to you. You wouldn't like it if this was done to other members of your family. Something that somebody can relate to personally.
They'd probably say, get the feck away from me. But I mean, but the point is, I mean, the interesting part of this question is the fact that it's been suggested. I mean, I know. Well, I think I know where this is coming from, and Grumpy Vegan Grandad will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's coming from the fact that there is a constituency in the movement who is suggesting that if the other animals could speak for themselves, they would use those words that we've talked about today in the show.
Okay, I see Pamela's joined us, but I think she's just getting set up. So we'll give Pamela another moment. So all right, may as well bring you in here. Welcome, Pamela. I know a language is a big focus for you. What do you think about this question?
Well, I think everybody's making some really excellent points, which are really sort of thought-provoking. But the thing is, when we communicate, it's not just what comes out of our mouths, is it? It's like, who is the audience? Okay. And one thing that doesn't seem to have come out in this whole sort of like discussion is our audience. Well, there seems to be like an unspoken assumption that our audience is basically sort of like white, non-Jewish, people like us, which is that the assumption? Because I would say it would change wouldn't it change our approach to the words that we're using? If we were, say, talking to a black person, would we be sort of like really gung-ho about using analogies about slavery? Or if somebody sort of like hopped something into the conversation, like, oh yeah, my mom died in the Holocaust, or my granny died in the Holocaust, or something like that, or I love bagels, I don't know what. Would we not be sort of automatically sort of thinking about what we're saying in a somewhat different way? Because I know from sort of like doing advocacy in Malaysia, you obviously wouldn't use words like Holocaust, because really it doesn't have any sort of, resonance there. It would just be, kind of quite weird, And similarly, I'm not sure about using words like slavery. So I think this is kind of a part of the conversation that we need to really think about. And if it would change the way that we're talking to the person that we're communicating with.
It's the point that I made, Pamela, with recipient design in my opening statement. I made that point.
I wasn't here for the opening statement. But what's
and another big part, sorry to jump in there, but navigating the harm we may cause, I think is an important part of the discussion, because I think there'll be people that use the analogy regardless. So if we can help talk about, if we are going to use the analogy, how to do it tactfully, that's an important part of the discussion too, to me. Which is our audience, and the content warnings, all that stuff. We do have another question. Antibreeder. Hello, Mark. I am getting some feedback. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that. No? Everyone's engrossed. So can the animal can the animal liberationists create better ways to measure the efficacy of their advocacy through specifically market research? That's a big question to me, because it doesn't really exist. I mean, I know Trent Gracian's research is really strong around setting clear end goals, and that's the best study I know that I can link maybe afterwards. To me, that's the biggest thing, though, as far as goal setting. But there's nothing sophisticated enough to say, are analogies effective? Which analogies? That kind of thing. Which storytelling helped?
Be very difficult, wouldn't it? Be very difficult to try to do that.
And very money. I mean, you need hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think, to really design an experiment that had any kind of use to it.
You could do some small scale surveys. You could do things like focus groups, which have been done, I believe. But you could, like for example, I've spoken about, you could set up close to the Go Vegan World posters, for example, and see whether people have noticed them, and whether they've what they make of them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and Deb's raised a great point about Seb did a video on phonolytics. So if we do want, I mean, I'm not sure if that specifically has data around, I know it talks about effective advocacy, so there might be something around analogies. That'd be interesting to know. But yeah, Pamela, is this an analogy that you've used yourself, would you say? Or do you kind of just, I mean, I guess there's lots of analogies, but specifically referring to animal use as a Holocaust or the animal Holocaust?
Not really, no, because it doesn't, I just feel I honestly understand what it means, but I don't think it necessarily resonates with who you're talking to. I think, is it a bit of kind of people are not really thinking about the impact of what they're saying, or maybe they just feel really, really angry, so they want to almost have a sort of like a subconscious pop at the person that they're trying to have this conversation with. Because I think there's a lot of anger, in vegan advocacy and in vegans in general. And sometimes it just sort of like comes out in the sort of language, the sort of behaviors that happen, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously, because there's, what that psychologist Claire Mann had that book Dystopia, didn't she? I haven't read it, but it's all about the pain that we're sort of like handling. So I think there's an awful lot going on with the communications, both to other vegans and, sort of, people that we're trying to sort of like talk to. And it probably would help us all to be kind of a bit clear about what we're trying to do. I mean, power and domination is part of a lot of relationships, and power and domination is conveyed in language, isn't it? And not just the words, though; it's the tone and attitudes.
Now, I think it's important. I think it's important to try and analyse what's the most effective way of doing things. But the underlying problem isn't really what type of outreach people do or how they do their outreach, but simply that not enough vegans do outreach, and that's our fundamental problem. Is that we need a lot more vegans to get out there, get active, get educating other people to go vegan. That's the fundamental problem we face in our movement. We only have a tiny percent of people who call themselves vegan that are involved in outreach. And if we're ever going to get anywhere, if we're ever going to achieve animal liberation, that is the fundamental thing we've got to change. We have to get more vegans active in spreading the message. Whatever way they do it, yeah, there's some ways are better than others. I agree. But the fundamental problem is there's not enough vegans doing it.
But doesn't that bring us back to our sort of like old favourite, the celebrity culture and the cult of the celeb, which is kind of gives a lot of people the impression that the celebrities are out there doing it. They're doing it for the animals, because the animals are voiceless. And therefore it kind of, then by sort of like, giving, perhaps to the Patreon account, everything is kind of like sorted, sort of like it's all done and dusted. So there's no need for the person that's giving to the Patreon that thinks this celebrity, whoever they are, is absolutely awesome. There's no need for them to even consider that they might need to sort of like do some kind of activism.
I think that can be part of the answer, and I take it you're not talking about Joaquin Phoenix kind of celebrity. You're talking about James Aspey type celebrity, right? But it used to be said, the same point used to be said about the national groups, that because you had all these experts working in these national groups, people in the grassroots didn't feel as though they necessarily had to do anything, because they had to pay people to do it rather than do it yourself. So some research on that would be really interesting, to find out why there are a lot of vegans who never become active. Now, there must be a reason for that. Now, what is it? And I imagine you'd end up with a very complicated story at the end of that. I think there's going to be loads of reasons why people don't do it.
I think it's
and equally why people stop.
And I think, there's a lack of role models of diversity of activism. I mean, I think, it's been so interesting sort of like talking to people like, Ronnie and actually Louise as well, about back in the day, and also my own experience of sort of like activism back in the day, because it was a completely different ballgame. And I know Roger's talked about this as well. Everybody basically seemed a bit more sort of, radical, and, seeing the linkages between different kinds of oppression, that's been talked about before. And I think that's part of it. And now we've got a very sort of like activism light vision in a lot of vegan land. I can't say everywhere, but in a lot of the vegan space, it's like this activism light sort of vision of what it's all about. So I think people need more role models, which is kind of what I'm trying to do on the channel, is like show people, showcase people that set up their own group, who've done a different kind of activism, and they can speak about it. Then people can actually sort of, because we're all simple people. If somebody says, "Oh, I did this and I did it like that. I set up this group," and or my experience of a demonstration or being in jail was this, that, and the other. It kind of demystifies it. So I think it kind of makes it almost just more real in some funny kind of way. And I think that's linked in with the whole sort of like cultural thing. My favourite N word, which I won't, not neoliberalism, which is the cult of celebrity, the cult of we're all powerless, and we are all creatures of that. So, I think that's all kind of, it's a big and a very toxic mix. And a lot of people also are very threatened by these notions, because they believe that living in the sort of like the neoliberal bubble is absolutely going to go on forever. And it's, we only need a bit of tweaking and then it's all going to be sorted out. So we don't need sort of like significant change. So I think it's a really sort of super complex, and I don't think it just applies to veganism. It's any kind of activism as well. It's definitely not just veganism.
There's a problem with what I call spectatorism. In other words, people confuse being the spectator with being an activist, and this is kind of, maybe one of the problems of the kind of YouTube celebs, that people will listen to those people and maybe go on Facebook and chat amongst themselves and all that. And that kind of gives them the feeling that somehow they're being active when they're not. I mean, for instance, it doesn't matter how many copies of The Guardian you read, it doesn't change anything, right? It doesn't change anything. It doesn't matter how many radical books you read, it doesn't change anything, or how many videos you watch, don't change anything. What changes what changes the world is getting out there and being active. That's what changes things, and people need to make this distinction between being an activist and being a spectator. By being a spectator, you are not being an activist, and this is the problem. And I think, particularly now that we've kind of gone into this kind of YouTube age and social media age and everything like that, that confusion kind of has arisen more. In the old days, we didn't have those things. We just had maybe the odd magazine that went round. That was it. So kind of there was a much clearer distinction then between, being an activist and being a spectator, and that doesn't exist so much now, and I think that's a problem.
Yeah, in academia, Ronnie, they talk about bystanders, and also there's an issue in social movements about free riders, and that is another kind of problem, that there is this kind of thing that somebody is interested in the cause and interested in the subject, but they might do something like well, somebody else is doing it, and so therefore I don't need to do it myself. That's called the free rider problem. Really, our aim, because we're focused on the grassroots, is not to say, well, because somebody's doing it in Leicester, you don't have to do it in Coventry. The idea is for everybody to do it everywhere. That's the difference. But I mean, it's not. You see, people think, well, there's already a James Aspie and a Joey and an Earthlings. I can't do that. But that's not what we're asking people to do.
But isn't it talking to Ronnie's point? Isn't it like you said? We need people to go out there and do things. We're not just sort of like spectators, but we need both, don't we? We need people who think about things, people who analyze things. Because I'm sure that I don't know, what was it like when back in the day when you and Roger as well, when you were doing your sort of like actual physical activism stuff. I mean, from conversations that I had mainly with Ronnie and also with Louise. Obviously there was a lot of people were thinking about stuff, weren't they? They were coming to sort of like radical perspectives, weren't they? I mean, it seems so. Even if you weren't reading stuff, these ideas were somehow in circulation. Whereas I think with a lot of people nowadays who call themselves activists, whether they're vegans or environmentalists or anyone else, these so-called radical ideas, of massive change are not really in their psyche. Does that make sense?
Well, and real quickly to that point, and then I think Roger had a comment to bring up. We had Carol on the show a while back, and just a quote that really resonated with me that Carol said was, "Without theory, activism can flounder. We're overwhelmed. There's so much to change and transform. But without activism, theory can be empty. It's like the heart and the mind." And then furthermore, the goal of theory is to empower. And an empowered activist is a stronger activist. So I absolutely agree. We need more activists, but I think they also need to have a bit of mindfulness about what activism they're doing. Which one could argue to get active and figure it out on your way. I'd probably get on board with that, but I do think they're two sides of a similar coin. You had a comment you wanted to bring up, Roger?
Yeah, well, there's a couple actually, but Grumpy Vegan Grandad 702.
Yep.
Yeah. Now I think this is kind of missing a big point here, Grumpy, actually, because we're in a social movement, and the movement is made up of human beings, and that's the truth about the social movement, which is called the animal rights movement or the vegan movement, is made up of human beings. And so it's not really just a question of trying to second guess what the animals would want us to say and what want us to do. We've got to consider it from the point of view of the sociological things that we know, the psychological things we do, which is that we need to develop a communication skill and technique and tradition, if you like, in order to try to persuade people of the case for animal rights. And that means one human being talking to another. So in some senses, it doesn't matter what the animals think or what we imagine the animals think, because
are we triggering harm, or are we triggering moral shock, or perhaps a combination of the two? I think the advocates for using the analogy would say, it's helpful in triggering that moral shock. So I don't think it's a I don't think it's a one size fits all explanation.
I remember in the 1980s, Wendy, I used to argue, this is in favor of kind of the ALF, if you like, that if you've got two people outside the laboratory and one has got a handful of leaflets and the other one is intent on smashing the door down, which one of those two would the animals want on their side? But again, it's missing the point. Because it's not as simple as that. We are a social movement, and that social movement is made up of human beings. There's no way around it. It's not as though, we can regret it if we want, but the reality is that we're a social movement made up of human beings. We've got to work with that.
Well, and to let all be just, and I'm not sure if we welcomed you. Welcome. A big misconception I see is the idea that to use or not use words like Holocaust is about not upsetting or offending, when it is rather about not perpetrating oppressions. And that's a really challenging one for me, because I see on one side the harm and perpetrating oppressions, and then on the other side can actually talking about it and raising other animals up to humans through these analogies. Can that actually help prevent future atrocities from happening? I don't know the answer to this question, but that's what this makes me think about.
Is that suggesting by using that term that would perpetrate oppression?
The comment, I believe, is suggesting that it kind of almost
how does that work?
If it's not used tactfully, perhaps. I mean, I don't want to speak for them, but it's. I mean, if it's not used in a way that's giving adequate weight to both injustices, maybe.
See, I didn't put my case in these terms, because, again, I think it's stronger when you talk about the rape thing and the ableist language in the movement. I think that is much more liable to do this than the Holocaust thing. There seems to be, to me, I don't understand the connection between those two things. I do when it comes to ableist language, which is a major problem in the movement. You can virtually not see any movement, any video for 10 minutes without people using ableist language. And we do know that it's not, again, just to repeat, it's not about the offense that it causes, it's about the harm it causes. If you're saying words like retard and crazy and insane, these are the words that domestic violence victims get called while it's going on. These are the words that rape victims get called. You're fucking stupid, you are, while they're being raped. If you use words like this, especially when people ask you not to, that's being very, very, very disrespectful. And that is perpetrating oppression. But I don't see it as much in this thing. If you could explain the link, I'd be interested, but I don't see it as much. I don't know why. Just don't.
Oh, and Brad's just correcting that's perpetuate versus perpetrate, which just for clarification purposes. It's a tough one. And I think, back to your quote, Roger, about words being loaded guns, that I think anything, even the word suffering, which we talk about a lot on the show, what do people actually think when they hear the word suffering? And do they think about the things we want them to think about? Do they think about ending animal use, or do they think about, reducing or minimizing suffering? It's, a lot in that.
I mean,
did you want to bring up that other comment? I think you had another.
Yeah, I could do. I think that was 704, I think.
Yeah, so Andrew's just saying, so what is being said is we must not describe what in reality happens to other animals, because we have to consider upsetting people who are complicit in the actions they are sensitive about. This makes me think of someone I've worked with in the past in animal advocacy that also does domestic violence work. And it's incredibly challenging. But, there's effective communication, there's not, and there's some things that motivate more than not. I mean, I think when we shame people, some may argue that's effective, and maybe for some people it is. But I think generally speaking, if we're shaming people and they're shutting down, they're going to keep doing what they want to do. So it's a really delicate balance, because I hear what Andrew's saying. We don't want to bend too much to the so-called will of the oppressor, talk to them the way they wish to be spoken. I think we also need to be tactful, though. And I think we can do both. I'd like to find that way in the middle, that we can be tactful with our language, and still send a strong message.
So we're wanting people we're wanting people to change their behaviour, aren't we? We're basically wanting people really to change their mindset and to change their behaviour because they've changed their mindset. That's what we're aiming at when we do outreach, and what we've got to think about is what is the best way we bring about that change. What do we say to those people that's going to bring about that change? I'm not sure talking to people about Holocausts is going to do that. I think talking more about what their personal effect is on other animals and how they can change that is probably a more effective way of doing outreach than talking about the Holocaust.
I wonder if it's less about individual words and maybe kind of creating scenarios and maybe word pictures that sort of like resonate with the person that you're talking to, that they can sort of like so see, you know, the animal that you're thinking of or the situation that you're thinking of. It might take a little bit more work initially, but then they're sort of like, or stories, you know, they're sort of then drawn into, in a sense, because I think this sort of like reductionist notion about the words on their own is just that. It's kind of like looking for silver bullets, isn't it? A magic bullet. Like, oh, we either use that or we don't use that. If we don't use that, maybe there's another word that will sort of like press the sort of like the trigger in the person we're talking to's mind. Then the vegan sort of switch that says, oh yeah, now we're going to go vegan, you know, because we pressed the vegan trigger. And maybe, I don't think change is like that, is it? I mean, it's much more complicated. So stories and, you know, word pictures might perhaps be, you know, or thinking about things like building empathy rather than the words, you know, building empathy, building rapport with the person that you're trying to have your one-to-one conversation with, or that we're having our one-to-one conversation with. Start off by thinking, well, you know, how can I build rapport? Have that always the number one thing. And I'm sure people do that. You know, some people will do that to a greater or less extent, depending on how whether they're people persons or not. But it might be more productive to have that sort of a thought in one's head. Rapport, stories, word pictures. You know, I mean, if you wanted to, you could even sort of like go the whole sort of like mirroring body language sort of stuff. You know, I don't know. I mean, I think that this sort of like words are power, but I think let's just, and I agree with this, don't use the Holocaust thing as well. But it's much, I think that's too reductionist, you know, and I do think, I'm sorry I missed the beginning, Roger, when you addressed the thing that we're just basically talking about, what it seems to me is we're imagining our audience's plight, and I'm not quite sure. I just don't, I feel baffled by that bit as well. You know, I feel baffled by it. Because that would seem to me, if we imagined our audience was anything other than white people, white able-bodied people, I think it would just automatically sort of like really shift, you know, fairly fast, the way that we were doing our communications and doing our advocacy. And maybe, you know, people that English wasn't their first language. Maybe it just needs to be a bit more like thinking outside the box.
Jeremy, can we put Andrew's thing back up again? Or do you want to move on?
I can't. I'll just have to find it.
704.
That was a 704?
Yeah.
All right, just give me a moment.
So I think this could really create a lot of interesting discussion within the movement. I mean, because I don't think you're not necessarily going to get an agreement about what really is happening to the other animals. I mean, I would push back on talking about artificial insemination in terms of rape. I think those two things are different things, and I think that by describing artificial insemination and about what's really going on there, which is the ruthless commodification and exploitation of female reproduction systems in order to create an offspring who is then an exploitable, expendable, and, you know, commodified being. That's what's going on there. We could, and then we've got the issue that we've discussed in this show already, Jeremy, which is, okay, well, even if we were to say, okay, in terms of these words that we've talked about, I agree exactly that that's what is really happening to other animals. That's one thing. Then there's the question of, okay, was it a good idea to say that? Is it effective? So is it accurate? Is it effective? And we've already said that. I mean, we have a difficult discussion trying to discover in what sense Holocaust is accurate. It's not accurate in terms of the Jewish Holocaust or the Holocaust. How is it accurate? It's not accurate in terms of the dictionary definition of Holocaust, except for the mass murder bit or the mass killing bit. But the bit by fire, it's not accurate anymore. So
Language is an imperfect tool, though, right? I mean,
I
know I'm not trying to fire up the debate again, but
no, but I mean, there's this assumption here that, well, we know what's really happening here, and we all agree on that. Well, there would be dispute about that even.
I don't think that's to me. That's more of a peripheral topic. Whether it's accurate or not, to me, it's more: is it getting people to think about other animals in a stronger way? That's the.
I'll tell you one which is the strongest for me, actually, which we haven't talked about much, is that I think if you ask the question, are other animals enslaved by humans? I think we would all say yes, they are. And so, by implication, that's a form of slavery. Okay, and then you get into those problems because, as Pamela said, if you're talking to African Americans, for example, or even if African Americans were talking to African Americans, would they want to use that language? So there's this thing: is it accurate? Is it useful?
Well, I like the flip it to test approach because to me, I mean, it's a really difficult one to unpack. But if we were talking about humans, we would use that language, correct?
Well, that's because that's.
So we've got yeah.
Well, that's because that's the kind of language. That's the kind of traditional language to describe what's going on in relation to humans.
Because we rank humans above other animals. To me, that's the point, isn't it? So
Yeah.
We're ultimately trying to deconstruct that, whether we deconstruct it through an analogy or through a different method to raise other animals up to the level of human, if you will.
If we could get species society to see what we do to other animals as a Holocaust, that would be great.
Is that not I'm not saying 100%, but at least part of the case for using it?
It's a case for thinking about it. But I said right at the beginning, if we've got to be damn careful about it. It's not a straightforward thing. I mean, like you brought up, maybe it was similar talking about rights. They're a bit abstract, and people would push back on all that. Well, at least, well, I suppose you would get into controversies there too. People might be offended by you trying to. I mean, like Tom Reagan's done that, right? I mean, people actually say that by talking about animal rights, you're denigrating human rights. All of these things need to be thought about very carefully, because we, as humans in a social movement, talking to other humans, and if it's true that our main methodology at the moment in the vegan movement is talking to people, then we've got to be very careful about what we say.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's no shortcuts.
I mean,
I guess I kind of take a nuanced position because I don't use it myself, but I also find it hard to build a case against using it if we're mindful of the harm it may cause and try to navigate that.
Because the basis of kind of what we're trying to do in many ways is to get people to see what's being done to animals to be as bad as something that's being done to humans or has been done to humans that those people are opposed to. In other words, that's where it's important to make a comparison. And, where people believe it's wrong to treat humans in a certain way, then you get them to see that it's also wrong to treat animals in that way or a similar way. So you're kind of making an analogy in that sense, aren't you? Through that kind of comparison.
But a lot of
Asia has an excellent point here around we're not going to deconstruct speciesism through Holocaust comparisons. People need to understand the concept of speciesism first before they'll see those comparisons as valid. I think that's a really strong point. The question I would ask is, can we do them as part of the same process? And I don't know to answer that question because I don't have personal experience doing that. Maybe someone in the chat does. But I think that's a really strong point. Can we actually deconstruct speciesism through the analogy?
Well, we could, but the thing is, I mean, a lot of people that we'll be talking to, if we're doing like one-to-one advocacy, will have their own sort of positions on things like, race or ableism or age or anything else. I mean, that's just part and parcel of human beings. And it seems, the more I think about it, it seems kind of quite a big ask to. And those are all maybe kind of, they won't have thought those positions through because we mainly haven't. And then it seems a bit sort of like weird to assume that everybody's kind of got this egalitarian sort of like position for everything. And therefore, by relating animals to humans who have got, like basic human rights, suddenly that's the magic bullet. Because a lot of people just don't. Do they? I mean, you look at the whole sort of like, we don't have to look far. We don't have to look very far. We can look across the water at Trump. We can look at attitudes towards, say, Muslim people. We can look here now. We can look at attitudes towards older people. We can look at attitudes towards sort of like women, here and now. Most people are very, they might have more. Most people are completely unaware of their own internalized oppressions and how that manifests. And so it's like, so you've got that whole soup of not knowing what you're dealing with on the other person. You yourself don't know really about your own sort of like structural oppressions. And then you're trying to introduce this other concept, which is quite startling in some senses, although quite simple in others, of speciesism. So if people basically have a fairly sort of like, worldview that is kind of like, well, like the Muslims, they are generally a bit sort of like, they can be a bit sort of troublemakers. Women, they generally sort of like, they're happier bringing up the kids sort of thing, and there's some of my best friends are black people, but, and they're all really great at dancing. If people have got that sort of generalized sort of like notion, how are we going to sort of then introduce, it seems that is, it just makes it more complicated. We're not dealing with these sort of like blank slates of people who are kind of like, human rights, good thing. We're dealing with people who are really conflicted about all sorts of things. And then
I was going to say that can kind of come later, because basically it's what you're trying to put across, certainly in terms of like when I do outreach, what I'm trying to put across to people is a very simple message. In other words, that, what they're doing by, obviously veganism is a lot more than people not consuming animals. It's a whole philosophy of animal liberation, but like we can kind of start with educating people not to consume animals, and then hopefully they'll kind of move further along the ethical road. If you're going in at that point, then I think what you need to say to people, look, this is the effects of you consuming animals. This is the suffering and the killing of animals that your lifestyle, your diet is causing, and it's totally unnecessary. And you can actually eat in a way that doesn't create the demand for these things to be done. So you're not talking about speciesism at all. You're not talking about animal rights. You're talking about somebody, changing their lives, changing their diet, changing their lifestyle. And hopefully, if the people do that, that'll be a start of a process, by which they kind of will come to think about speciesism and will come to think about other ways that animals are oppressed, and change accordingly or take action accordingly. So initially, trying to get somebody to become vegan, or at least to adopt a vegan diet, is really quite simple, and it doesn't involve talking about speciesism. I don't think it even involves talking about animal rights. I think it involves talking about the impact that those people are having, negative impact those people are having on other animals, and how they can avoid that.
Well, and to Deb's point, which I think is a strong one, how are we supposed to get humans to consider the rights of other animals without some kinds of comparisons? So it's almost, I think a lot of people use, non-human species comparisons. What's the difference between a dog and a pig, for instance? I think this should be done carefully too, and caveat that, dogs don't have the level of respect we're seeking for all animals either. But I mean, maybe that's part of the discussion. What comparisons should we use? I feel like that, we could definitely spend some time on.
Well, I think we probably have. That ties in with another thing from our Grumpy Vegan Grandad at 7:28. We have to use terms that the majority of people understand, which is a point that I made in my opening statement. But there's two more aspects to that. You have to use terms that people understand. At the same time, our advocacy involves challenging those people. So that's the ripening up thing, the Donald Watson thing, that we need to ripen people up to new ideas while we're talking to them. So we've got to use language that they understand. At the same time, we have to challenge their speciesism. And at the same time, we have to make sure that in our conversation, we don't lose them. And that's where the thing that we've talked about all afternoon comes in. The idea that by choosing the comparisons in Deb's sense, are we going to choose the ones that are going to be helpful to us, or are we going to choose the ones that are going to make our job more difficult? And that, in some senses, that's what we've been talking about all day. That does by choosing that comparison help us? And I'm suggesting we should, at the very least, think very, very carefully about whether we want to choose those three words that we've talked about in particular, or not. And I don't think we should have a knee-jerk reaction to kind of, somebody's trying to make me not use these words, and therefore, so I'm going to. That's not really what we're after. We're after a reasoned, sensible discussion about, are these the ones we should use and why? And that's what it's all been about all afternoon, isn't it?
I'm more curious about you feeling like we've been talking all day. It's only been a couple hours. I mean, I know you've done 7-hour live streams, but this isn't that just yet.
All afternoon, I said, didn't I?
We'll go back to the tape for that one. We probably will wrap up in the semi-near future. I've dropped the link in the chat, so feel free to, if you want to join us by video chat, or just drop a question. If you put the Q, it's easier for us to find, and then we'll make sure it's addressed. Because, I think with all these things, the fundamental key to effective communication on these complex things is feeling heard and understood. So we certainly don't want anyone to feel like their views aren't being adequately covered here. We tried to do it through the earlier discussion, but it's a complicated thing. I think human interrelations, as you might be able to speak to, Roger, with your sociology experience.
Can I just mention that this idea of thereocide has come up a couple of times. Nella's been talking about it. Yeah, that's right. And so that actually goes to at least one person who's talked about it. I'm not sure whether he coined it, but I used to work with a criminologist called Piers Burns, and I did a paper with him in 2001 about ripping horses to pieces and this kind of stuff. And he came up with this idea, or at least he's discussed this idea. But again, it's interesting because it's obviously a word that people are not familiar with. But that's the way that new ideas come into being. Peter Singer started animal liberation with an apology that in terms of I hope you don't kind of think that the idea of animal liberation is a laughable idea, because he kind of saying people were so unused to hearing the idea of animal liberation that people might laugh at it. And the same went for a few years later when Tom Reagan brought the idea of moral rights in terms of other animals. Well, yeah, but you see, by talking about ideas like this, that's how you get people used to them. And obviously, you know, I mean, I'm not even sure how to even pronounce that word because we don't.
I think it's got the German for animal is Tier, Tier, and I think this is a common root in these two words. It means like the killing of the killing of animals. I mean, it could take. I mean, the word ecocide, for instance, is something that's kind of fairly recently come into common speech, and so there's probably no reason why this word shouldn't as well.
I mean, like, you know, it's difficult to know whether a word is going to be useful or not. I mean that one of the reasons why carnism, this vegetarian idea, is more popular in the vegan movement than speciesism is because, you know, I think it's easier for people to say. I think it's easier for people to think about, and I think it's also from the activist point of view, it's got a bit of a kind of punch to it. You know, you're a carnist. You know, that kind of slur thing to it. So I mean, there's quite a lot of activists who prefer a vegetarian concept rather than the vegan one, which is really fascinating. But is that because we just don't use that phrase often enough? We haven't even ripened ourselves up to it, so we can't ripen the public up to it because we haven't ripened ourselves up to it.
Well, it's both, doesn't it? Yeah, those both have to happen. Because to that point, I mean, do you think calling someone a speciesist has a punch to it? Because I was watching a video earlier today where the person basically said, you know, I'm speciesist and I think it's okay. So it doesn't have the same punch as racism does. Now, I think that comes from a fundamental lack of understanding what speciesism is. But I mean, if we call someone a speciesist, if they do understand it, is it, you know, going to derail a conversation? I'm trying to unpack that one because non-vegan just seems a bit light as an alternative between the two.
Well, there is a research paper called "Proud to be Speciesist."
You'll have to share that one with me.
You could call it an entirely different word, of course, but then I'm likely to become vegan. But
you could call them a human supremacist, couldn't you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I like human supremacist. I think it's less ambiguous.
You know, and it kind of it's kind of quite accessible, I think, as well. And I think it would create a bit of a. It has a more. I don't know. I just think it's more accessible.
So, are we shutting this down? Does anybody else want to join for a minute, or what?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've tried to catch up on the comments, so hopefully, thank you everyone who's joined this for the bulk of it. This is probably I know everyone here's done longer ones, I think, than this, but I think it's one of the longer ones I've done as far as a YouTube side of things. So. If you joined us from the start, that's brilliant. I mean, if anybody else does have anything to add in the chat, just putting that Q or join us to make a final point. Hopefully we've done the topic justice. I mean, I don't know if anybody's, we certainly shifted the view of some of the not sures. So maybe that's an evidence that this was a worthwhile discussion, but we're not just going to do it in one chat, are we?
No. And we need, before we go, Roger and I need to do a plug for our comedy show on Wednesday evening, 7:30 Wednesday evening on this channel, Roger's channel. We've got a comedy show, Jailhouse Vegans, about our humorous experiences. Well, probably the first one will probably be mainly mine because Roger's only a very young chap compared with me.
And you're but also, just to clarify, it's going to be streamed to my YouTube only, folks. So this one gets streamed to Jeremy's YouTube, my YouTube, and Facebook. This one on Wednesday is because I'm poor. I'm not bourgeois like
making classes for it.
Who could afford this?
I don't think I've ever been called that. There's a first time for everything.
But it will be very funny. I guarantee that.
Jeremy's using his Patreon account to buy this big.
And it's for a very good cause, as a sanctuary, a sanctuary for farmed animals, mainly sheep. That's badly in need of funds, like I suppose all sanctuaries are, but we're doing it for this particular one, a very worthy cause, and well worth tuning into. And I mean, you can listen afterwards; it'll be there as a recording afterwards. But if you want to watch it live, 7:30 p.m. Roger's channel, Wednesday evening.
Yeah, it's exclusively cheap then, Ronnie. No.
Sorry, mate. It's not just sheep.
Yeah.
It's not. It's mainly sheep. They got other animals. They got goats and turkeys as well there, but it's mainly a sheep sanctuary. Try and say that quickly. Sheep sanctuary.
Should we talk about sheep speciesism at a sanctuary? Sheep survivors at a non-speciesist sanctuary?
Yeah, you end up saying.
Hey, Grumpy wants me to shave my head for charity. It's not going to happen. What do you think of that idea, Jennifer?
I already did shave my head, so please give money. My head was shaved the other day. My hair was just like Roger's, really long.
It just fell out, didn't it, Ronnie? I thought
it
just fell out.
It fell out after talking to you, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Tearing it. That's going to be one of your hilarious stories.
Yeah.
About prison, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, did you want to do a quick pitch for tomorrow's, Roger? For so tomorrow, just an hour, starting an hour later, 6 p.m.
Yes,
hour later than this one did.
6 p.m. Just again on my just on my poor single solitary YouTube stream because I'm not bourgeois like Jeremy.
You got to take your fundraising seriously. Shave your head. You've got the thing. You just have to execute.
Yeah, I need a few tattoos. I'm actually, I must be a terrible vegan. I haven't got a single tattoo, So
well, you can just write something in biro on you.
Yeah, but it would. Yeah.
And people show up.
Anyway, we talk about the environment. In particular, we're asking, is environmentalism part of veganism? Essentially, what's the actual title? Is the environment a vegan issue? That's it. Don't be laughing at me, Jeremy. I was going to get there in the end.
It's been a long one. I hear you.
It generally does.
I haven't got any strength now that I've shaved my head.
The reason why you can't shave it is because it's a wig.
Well, I mean, this is a thought experiment.
I know your secret.
So how much money would it take for you to shave your head? That's an interesting one. If it was for sanctuaries, it wouldn't take much for me.
Yeah, do it live on one of these where you shave.
I'd do that.
Shave your head, or get someone to shave your head.
No,
live
I can't. I can't. So I can't.
No,
I do that. I don't know what the total be. Would it be 100, 500 or something pounds? If that's going to a sanctuary, I'd do it. I mean, it's a pandemic. We don't have to see each other hardly anyway. It's my partner and dogs that would probably be the most.
£500 wouldn't get me towards Panama, would it? So what's the point?
Well, you have to supplement it with your OnlyFans account, and then you're good to go.
No, you got to shave your head.
I think Grumpy should grow his hair for veganism. You both could do it, Ronnie and Grumpy.
I can try and grow it.
Have a kind of growing your hair race.
Shave yours off and send it to me, and then I'll put it on my head, and I'll get sponsored for that. So we get double.
Well, yeah, you think
I like that efficiency?
You're going to get money by wearing a wig of my hair. How's that going to work?
Well, people probably would be amused, so they might give a few bob.
I wouldn't think so.
Because I might look as funny as you with that hair. See,
we're just talking shite now, Jeremy.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone. I know for me this was a challenging one, both research and to navigate. So hopefully the chat helped us all to do that going forward and find ways to better communicate with one another. Yeah. See you tomorrow, Monday, 6 p.m. time, about the environment and its relationship to animal rights.
Cheers, folks.
Bye.
Bye.